What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and typically I'm analyzing apologists apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, though, we're talking with Richard Carrier. Now, the last time, Rick, I had you on the channel, it caused a pretty big kerfluffle. I feel like that's like really downplaying the kerfluffleness of the kerfluffle that exploded, but apparently people
Always
were
hilarious.
offended.
Yeah. Over silly things, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But today we are here to talk about the history of mythicism, whether or not that has any kind of effect on the current academic research into the idea that Jesus probably never existed, and then also like the shifting consensus, like where has consensus shifted over the past 10 years since Rick published on the historicity of Jesus. And we've got a bunch of clips that we are going to be going through from some claims that were made by Chrissy Hansen. She's been kind of going around talking about the history of mythicism, kind of tying it to some things. And so we kind of just wanted to talk about that a little bit. Of course, Dr. Richard Carrier, do you want to let everybody know where they can find you, how they can support you, and everything like that?
Yeah, all things Richard Carrier are at richardcarrier.info. So just one word, richardcarrier.info. You can find my Twitter feed there, my Facebook feed, my articles, obviously, all my books. And if you want to take my courses, I do online courses. You can take that stuff there. The link is there. And also on that site, I have a guide to my social media. So if you search the blog for the article Guide to My Social Media, that'll tell you which things to follow, depending on which things you are interested in, because my different social media, I do different things with. And then, yeah, like the classes, if you want to take the online classes, check out Take Classes, that link on the top and my website, and then look into that. I've actually got some very soon to roll out. I'm starting one course, and there will be more, but I'm doing a video course through MythVision. So MythVision will actually be hosting more and more of my courses. And so people are interested in that. That's going to happen. Keep your eye out for the next couple of weeks. I'll make an announcement on that. But other than that, yeah, everything you want to know about me. And also if you want to get my work, or the blog is important too, because it's supported by Patreon patrons. So I really welcome people who support that, because I'm a long form blogger, which is a weird dinosaur species in the internet these days. So if you like deeply informative long form blogging on obscure subjects of philosophy and history, become a supporter, become a Patreon supporter, and then you get certain perks. The Patreon page will fill you in on all that, and that link to my Patreon page is on my website as well, so you can find that there. And then my blogs, I write on tons of things. So if you have a question about what does Carrier think about X, Y, or Z, just plug X, Y, or Z in the search engine and look for it. I've probably written on it. And if I haven't, message me and let me know if I may or may not be interested in writing a blog about it.
Yeah, and I have to say a couple of things here. One, the courses that Rick teaches, they're different than when I went, because I think I did it through the secular web.
Yeah. They're very similar. They're just run through Google Groups now. So the interface is different, but the content is largely similar. And the way I teach it is very similar. It's asynchronous, so there's no scheduled lectures. It's all readings, challenge questions, and Q&A, basically in a text forum environment for a month. Basically, you just get to pick my brain for a month for a very low fee, remarkably low fee compared to what my usual hourly is. That's what my courses are. And so I've published peer-reviewed work in both philosophy and ancient history, and actually many of the subjects that I teach. So you actually get to pick the brain of an actual published PhD in these subjects. So that's valuable. A lot of people get access to that. So that's the main. I always think the main advantage of those courses is the ability to pick someone's brain who's an expert. But also it's just got all of the these are the things that you should read to get really familiar with the subject. These are the questions you should be able to answer to show that you really grasp the issues. And the way I teach is mainly to make people capable of navigating the issues themselves, right? To give you enough understanding of methodology and the facts for you to actually come to your own conclusions. And that's the main goal of every course that I do. And of course, yeah, there's lots of information and I have my own opinions and things, but I make very clear, like, there's the methodology of what you should read, and then, you know, read the best counter argument, and then apply the skills to come to your own conclusion.
Yeah, and like I was saying, the course is phenomenal. Like the course that I took, at least, and I believe that course was on like the New Testament, like how the New Testament was developed and all this other stuff, and or something around that area. But it was very informative. I loved the setup of it and everything like that. So I encourage people to take courses like that if you're really interested in it. And then also the blog. One thing that I really hate about a lot of sites that post blogs or news articles or whatnot is, they are filled with ads, but yours doesn't have ads really.
Nope.
I mean, you've got some like
100%.
a little bit on.
Yeah, totally patron supported. Even like things that look like ads that are down the margin are just links to my stuff, basically, right? So I mean, I make money off of, like, if you buy something on Amazon through my site, those links, I'm an affiliate, I get my 7% commission. So yeah, like buy things through the links there. And I'm allowed to say this. So that's what I do. I'm basically, a shill for Amazon, but that's because they pay a decent commission on sales. So, so yeah, there's no annoying ads. Nothing interrupts the text with like gaudy sales pitches or horrible photographs or things that I really hate about ads on sites. And it's not behind a paywall. That's the other thing that, the patrons are supporting. What they're really paying for is that they're contributing so that this stuff will be freely available. So it's essentially, like, a lot of them, like, they want to be able to point people to read the articles. That doesn't help them if it's behind a paywall, because no one, people are not going to pay even $2 to read an article. But so it's through the patron support that allows me to make this ad-free and free to the world. So anybody in the world can go and read my articles and not have to deal with paywalls, not have to deal with ads. And that is really what the patrons are supporting, and what I really appreciate, because I get a lot of support that way, and could always use more. And so I definitely appreciate my patrons.
Definitely. And so for everybody that's watching the live stream tonight, if you want to ask Carrier a question near the end of the stream, we will be going over any super chats that we get. I know Carrier loves to interact with people's questions and thoughts about various topics, not just mythicism, but we kind of are covering the mythicist topic tonight. So if you have a question to ask, feel free to do a super chat, and we can get to that later. So all right, Rick, are you ready to start talking about the history of mythicism?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I guess I kind of wanted to set this up a little bit. Is does the history behind mythicism, like leading up to your on the historicity of Jesus, like wherever that the academic community was or had, or whatever they had done, does that really have a lot of effect on whether or not it's true, or did it have any effect on the historicity of Jesus?
No, not really. So first of all, like, knowing the historiography of a thing is only rarely useful to understanding the true facts of the thing, right? So, like, it's useful to know the history of the historicity of Jesus, the history of the three quests and so on, because then you can see all the different ways that things have succeeded or failed. You can see what has been tried before, what has been proposed, and so on. So, but all of that, most of that is actual, like, peer-reviewed academic studies going back 100 years, right? So studying the quests can be useful. It isn't necessarily going to help you answer the question of what is the evidence now, right? Like, 'cause you've got to, did Jesus exist? You got to list the evidence, essentially, and then assess the evidence one way or another. And knowing the deep history of the quest for the historical Jesus is going to inform that very little. Like, you're looking at the end product of all those failures, basically, right? So, like, knowing the history of all the failures doesn't help. What the field is doing is the vanguard of the field today will be all the collected stuff that's held up or at least survived that long. Everything that was bad is generally going to get chucked away. Now, occasionally something good gets chucked away, and so those are the gems that you find. But when you find those things, it's not by studying the history of the quests, it's by studying a specific issue. And the example would be when I did my postdoc study that resulted in the peer-reviewed book on the historicity of Jesus. One of the things I came to realize was the whole Barabbas narrative, right? The whole idea that, oh my gosh, the whole Mark 6 or Mark 15, that whole thing is just the Yom Kippur. And you have Jesus, son of the Father, and then you have this other Barabbas, son of the Father, and you have the two goats. One atones for the sins of Israel, one carries the sins of Israel. I mean, it's all makes perfect sense as a Levitical allegory. And I thought, like, well, am I the first one to notice this, right? And so I did a literature review, and I found that it had actually been independently discovered at least 2 times in the literature, but it just kept getting forgotten. So it didn't survive in the collection of stuff. If you go reading the Vanguard literature today, that point rarely comes up. It's obscure at all. And even the 2 authors I found, I didn't even know about each other, right? So it's this, basically the wheel keeps getting reinvented. The same thing keeps getting rediscovered, which is a good sign, because if 3 independent people, completely independent of each other, are seeing the same thing in the text, that actually is supporting that you probably are seeing something that's really there, right? So anyway, but that didn't require me to study the history of the quests, right? It just required me to do a literature review on that one question, deep literature, who's written on this before, search the databases and so on, and read the articles. So you don't really need to know the history of Jesus, right? But it still is interesting and is valuable. And I would say the same thing is true for mythicism, except with one major difference, is that almost all mythicism has been garbage. To be honest, right? Like, it's not peer reviewed. A lot of it is amateurish. A lot of it is crank, easily strawmanned. I mean, it is strawmans itself. Like, that's what I mean. It's like, it's so bad. There's been very, very little peer reviewed mythicism in history. We had a short bout of it in the early 20th century. And then it got shut down. Like, basically the Shirley Jackson case wrote a book, and everybody assumed that it had been refuted. And then it doesn't get revisited very much at all for roughly 100 years, a little less than 100 years. And then I published my book. Now, the idea comes up occasionally in the literature, but no one really like assiduously explored the hypothesis, pro or con, right? Like, no one wrote a book about it. Did Jesus exist? Like, that's not a thing. What they wrote about was which historical Jesus is true. So they just assume historicity, and then on that assumption, try to argue what type of Jesus, what was the historical Jesus? Was he a zealot? Was he a pacifist? Was he a stoic? Was he a cynic philosopher? Was he an apocalyptic prophet? Was he a Buddhist? Like, you can find all of that stuff in the literature. Some of it ridiculous and some of it not. So what happened was, when I was at the Secular Web as editor-in-chief, well, first the feedback editor, I was a very snarky anti-mythicist feedback editor, and then editor-in-chief. And one of the things that, out of my frustration, as I wrote way back then, was my article against Kersey Graves, because I was sick and tired of people citing Kersey Graves as 16 crucified saviors at me. And I'm like, no, that's garbage. That's not reliable scholarship at all. And so I wrote my article about not only that it was wrong, but like what things to look for, like why it was wrong, and why you can find in other works, like you can look for to see like what is the difference between quality and garbage argument. And anyway, so I was rabid anti-mythicist, and at that time all we had was the woo stuff like Acaria S, Dorothy Murdoch's sun god astrotheology worship stuff, and Joseph Atwill's like the Roman government invented Christianity, like the weird conspiracy theory that he has. Those are the only things that we had, were those kinds of ridiculous things. Freak and Gandhi was another, commonly the Jesus mysteries. It was very, very terrible. Neither of them is a competent historian, and it was very badly argued. And it wasn't peer reviewed. So peer review would have made a much better work of it. So anyways, we had a lot of terrible stuff. So it was easy to debunk and easy to reject. And you could easily say like, no, this is terrible. There's nothing to learn from this. It would be it's so much work to debunk it. It's just a waste of time to even read in the first place. So that was the state of things until various number of different people whose opinions I respected convinced me to read Earl Doherty's book. And they said, no, this is different. This is not astrotheology. It is not the conspiracy theory stuff. This is like a serious academic argument. And it looks convincing, but we're not historians. You are now. Like, would you do a review of this? And enough people told me this to convince me to do it. And I read Doherty's book, and I realized, yeah, this is actually a cut above all of that stuff. It was actually almost like dissertation quality. In fact, when I did my review, I have like the criticism section where all the points that I would criticize, which would basically have been if I were his dissertation advisor and that was a dissertation, my list of things would be fix all these things and you'll pass, right? Like he was close to a pass. He just had to like adjust essentially, right? And that's what a good peer review would do that too. You would get a report back that says, hey, this is salvageable, but you have to fix these things for it to be publishable. And you do that in much more detail if you're a dissertation advisor or on a dissertation advisor committee for someone who's doing a doctoral dissertation. So I think what he had was a really good first draft of a doctoral dissertation. And it totally, he had the means and the skills to have taken it all the way had he ever, had the money to get into a PhD program to do it. But he never did. He had other plans in life and did his own thing. But what this did is it led me to realize that, okay, so there's a decent case to be made. It's still not peer reviewed. There's still not a proper academic response to it. This put me in an academic sort of agnostic position where I was like, well, I'm not sure now, right? And then, of course, in 2008, and this might be come up later, in 2008, the economy collapsed. And that just wreaked havoc everywhere, right? And one of the things it is freeze on hires for humanities majors. So there were no jobs there were no professorships to get, right? They're either eliminating positions or not hiring for them. And the few positions there were being gobbled up by people who, have long history of teaching and want their choice plum positions or whatever. So basically getting a job for a newly minted PhD was impossible in 2008. I would have to have waited like 3 or 4 years to even have a chance to get into the market. I had actually burned out on academic, politics by then. So I did not like the job of professor. I saw what it was like from inside. Being a professor is a shit job. I do not recommend it. There's so many things that are terrible about it. Interdepartmental politics, the overworking, they overwork you, like they stick you on a million bullshit committees, the infighting over who gets what office, who gets what hours for which classes, and the sort of petty backstabbing. I mean, it was just miserable. And I was like, I don't like this. It totally blew away my romantic notion of what a professor was, right? By that point, I was thinking, like, can't we just do research and teach? Like, why do you have to ruin the job with all this other crap? And then, of course, at the same time, they were hugely cutting the salaries, right? So they were, first of all, eliminating tenure positions. So the number of tenure positions are shrinking. And they're replacing professorships with adjunctships, which actually pay less than minimum wage. So these are PhD people. When you add up the hours you have to do to manage these courses, you're getting less than minimum wage. And so adjuncts, you can Google this, and adjuncts complain about the destruction of academia with the whole recourse to adjuncting, which is a for-profit. It's basically just corporations, universities acting as corporations trying to get work for free. But anyways, it ruined the market. And so you add that, the collapse of the economy. So I went to my fans and I said, hey, look, if you can help me cancel my $20,000 of student debt, get me a research grant that covers that, I'll devote my PhD to any subject you want. And unanimously, everybody who wanted to put into this fund said Historicity of Jesus. We don't care if it's true or false. We just want to hear your judgment on it. And that resulted in my postdoc research project, which resulted in the books, right? So Proving History and then On the Historicity of Jesus. That wouldn't have happened had none of those other things happened. Like if I hadn't been funded to do it, I didn't care enough about the issue to devote so much time and effort to it. But the end result was that it made me like the world's leading expert, one of the world's leading experts on the historicity of Jesus, because I spent 6 years studying nothing but that. And then getting the first book to systematically argue the case one way or the other that had been published under peer review in almost 100 years. The last one was Case, which their second edition was the early 20s or late 20s, 1920s, right? So I forget now, we're in the 2020s now. So and then mine came out in 2014. So almost 100 years before anybody had done anything. And so that changed my position. And the whole goal at that point, now what we've got historicity of Jesus on a peer-reviewed basis that actually is meeting the standards of the field and is actually doing the things that all the historicity of Jesus stuff had been doing for the last 100 years. So if you do the quests for the historical Jesus, most of that is peer-reviewed scholarship over the last 100 years. There's something substantive to follow there. Whereas there hasn't been that tradition for mythicism. There's this huge 100-year gap where it was just all garbage and nobody was applying, PhD skills to this properly to do this. And so mine is the first. Raphael Latastre came out with a follow-up study that gets roughly the same results, and he published that with Brill in 2019. So now we have 2 peer-reviewed books arguing that Jesus probably didn't exist, or that we can't say he probably did. And still, there's been no book since Shirley Jackson case in the 1920s. There's been no book doing the other side of that through peer review. So we've never had it. We have not yet had a peer-reviewed book arguing for the historicity of Jesus, which is a problem. And I think that's a problem that the field needs to address. And I hope they do address it soon, because now it's 2-0 for the 21st century on this. But that means that there's very little to study for the history of mythicism, because it's all crankery. It's the history of crankery, right? It's the history of, Joseph Atwill. Before that is the Piso. He just revamped the Piso conspiracy, which is not the real Piso conspiracy, which was for the assassination of Nero, but the fake made up crank Piso conspiracy, where the Piso family supposedly invented Christianity for purposes of the Roman Empire or whatever. It's a dumb theory, but you have that thread. So there's a history of that, but who cares? It's all bullshit. So why do you want to know the history of it? It doesn't help you. There's a history of astrotheology. There's been a lot of really good peer-reviewed work on astrotheology for other religions, like Mithraism, for example. David Ulanzi's book on Mithraism is a classic in astrotheology. But there's not been any, Christianity does not originate. None of the early Christian works have anything to do with astrotheology. Even if that stuff creeps in later, it's not in the origins of Christianity. So all the astrotheology stuff that goes back more than 100 years is just all crank, ridiculousness. There's also the sort of the Kemetic theory that the Christianity is entirely ripped off from Egypt. It's like point by point. It's just completely ripped off from Egypt. That's also false, but that has its own history. There's a whole history of that goes way back. And so you could, and also, there's others like that, but there's a lot of weird things on the side. There's theories that the Gospel of Mark started out as a play, and it was just a play, and then people started believing it, and that started Christianity. And then there's the theory that Christianity was really just Buddhism, that Jesus went to India, learned some Buddhism, and came back, and it was really just all misunderstood Buddhism. So there's been a lot of weird stuff like this that hasn't passed peer review. It's all crankery. So studying the history of it is interesting for people. I value people who are doing it. So I think the fact that Chrissy Hansen is building literature that's sort of basically creating this bibliography of here's a bunch of the history of this crank movement is valuable in and of itself, right? The history of the history is valuable in and of itself, but it has no value for answering the question of whether Jesus existed or not, because it's all been crank, right? Not all of it, but you really got to look at the history of the peer-reviewed stuff. And there's been such a huge gap between when that was even done that even the old peer-reviewed stuff is so obsolete now that it doesn't hold up, as does hardly any history of Jesus stuff from back then either. Shirley Jackson Case's book is amateurish by current standards, right? By the standards of the time, it was top of the line. But nowadays, it's obsolete. And that's a pro-historicity book, and it is obsolete. And even a historicist would admit that. They'd read this this is really out of date. And you could say the same thing for Dreves and the other peer-reviewed scholars of the time that were doing mythicism way back 100 years ago. So I don't think studying the history of mythicism is helpful for the actual peer-reviewed version of mythicism. Peer-reviewed version of mythicism is dealing with serious scholarship, serious methods, doing it properly, and using proper methodology and actual documented, verifiable facts and things like that. And the history of mythicism has very little of that. It has some of that, but very little. Unlike the history of Jesus, which also has a lot of false stuff in it, but at least it's not crank false stuff, right? It's stuff that evolved over time as people proposed ideas and questioned them and so on, and it evolved over time. So that history is different from the history of mythicism. So I don't find the history of mythicism terribly useful. And to give you an example of that, when there was one of the videos we're talking about today is Chrissy Hansen did on just mythicism and Marxism. And she makes a key point in there, which I also made in my article on Chrissy Hansen's reviews of my stuff, which is that was all crank. It was all propaganda. It was all basically endorsed, if not funded, by the USSR. These were not serious peer-reviewed journals or books. These were Marxist wackadoos doing the state business, right? So it's completely useless, right? This is not serious scholarship that's trying to get at the truth. This is propaganda. We just can't use it. So that's why I never cite or use, and we're not in any way influenced by any Marxist mythicist, because they're all useless, right? They're as useless as Arcaria S or Atwill or anything like that. So understanding the history, I think it's interesting, and I think it's great listening to Chrissy Hansen go through the history of Marxist mythicism, but it's of no use to us answering the question of whether Jesus existed or not, basically.
Yeah, and when Chrissy was talking about that, I got a lot of, I guess, indications that it's similar to the whole atheism versus state atheism conversation. You know, comparing like the mythicist work in the USSR and all that to, you know, modern mythicism, which I feel like is the way that she was kind of leading the audience in the narrative. As I listen, because I listened to 2 interviews that she did recently, which was like I think about 4 hours worth of content.
Yeah, pretty much. And one of them was just on Marxism, and the other was on the whole picture with a little bit on Marxism, which kind of repeated some of the stuff from the other video. But that includes, by the way, Chinese mythicism. So I found some lists, and Hansen herself has done some lists of Chinese mythicists, but they're all Communist Party of China. So this is useless, right? This is not serious scholarship. This is not peer-reviewed scholarship. You can't trust this stuff. It's unusable for that reason. So it's interesting to see that it happens, but it doesn't have anything to do with peer-reviewed mythicism today. We're not using their work. We're not doing the same thing they're doing. Our theories aren't the same as theirs. So like there's no etymological, there's no like historical causal connection. So it has no use to that. And you could think of it, and Chrissy does do a good job of showing how it sort of originates with Drews, who's this German, Arthur Drews, who's this German scholar who's probably the most accomplished mythicist doing serious mythicism, like peer-reviewed scholarship in the early 20th century. And his stuff influences the Marxists, and then their stuff influences the Communist Party of China, and separately influences the threads that lead to Atwill and Dorothy Murdoch, and thus eventually to Doherty and Carrier and Lataster, right? But they're growing separately. There's no cross contamination, so none of the Marxist stuff is even talking to or influencing the stuff in the West. So it's just a separate kind of weird thing, but it's more comparable to the crank mythicism in the West. So it's the Marxist and Chinese stuff is more like Dorothy Murdoch and Joseph Atwill than it is like any of the peer-reviewed stuff, whether even Drews, right? It's less like that stuff. It's more of the like exaggerated crank things and bad arguments and fallacies and things like that.
Yeah. And I guess to sort of lead into some of the issues that both you and I had with both of those interviews, one of the things that Chrissy goes through is what was the earliest evidence that we have of mythicists existing, or rather maybe not mythicists in the modern sense that we understand them, but just people that didn't think that Jesus actually existed on earth, that he
or at least doubted it, right? Questioned it,
right?
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And so we've got our first clip here from Chrissy, and she's talking about the dialogue with Trypho and a section of that people regularly tout as like evidence that there are at least some people that don't think that Jesus ever walked on the earth. So did you want to like say anything before we watch the clip, or you want to just go ahead and watch the clip?
Just very briefly, like from what we were just talking about, the one thing that I did miss, I think was missing from Chrissy Hansen's presentations, is she does a lot of like bibliographic documenting of this stuff, but doesn't do much showing influence, right? Because you have like the Atwill thread is completely different from the astrotheology thread of Murdoch, which is completely different from the thread of Doherty, right? So there's clearly different traditions with different influences going on. And she didn't do any of that. And so, I mean, that's a really weak criticism. It's not a big deal. Like what she's doing is still fine. But what I would have liked to have seen that I thought would have been more informative is to show the sort of causal connections and the way it influence. So for instance, where is Doherty getting some of his ideas, for example, and tracing those back to the 19th century? It doesn't mean that Doherty's replicating what they're doing back then. He's doing better work than they are. But you could at least show sort of like how the ideas get winnowed down and how bad ideas get shuffled away. And then the good ideas, survive the process of selection, right? You could do a history of that, but she didn't do that. And she didn't really distinguish the different threads, so like the Atwill thread versus the Dorothy Murdoch thread, much less the Doherty thread. Like where did these separate? Where do they come from? How did they arise? Like that would be an interesting project into itself. It's not what Chrissy Hansen's doing. But what she is doing is still useful and commendable in terms of like at least documenting this stuff, because then you can go to her work. You've got the bibliographies, and now if someone wants to do the causal history, they can use her work to build on that. And that's what good scholarship does. Like it creates stepping stones that other people can build on. So that is valuable, and I want to give her credit for that. Before we start like criticizing her, so let's get into that.
Yeah, I know that you've mentioned before how Chrissy's work can be kind of like, I guess, good on one hand, but also bad on another hand.
Yeah, she's a very competent amateur, probably the most competent amateur I know. She's definitely on par with Doherty. Like Doherty was doing surprisingly good stuff. Like I think he just had a bachelor's, maybe a master's in Greek. But he was doing like I said, dissertation level work. And I think Chrissy Hansen's definitely on par with that. And so she does do good work. I think that she makes mistakes and has a problem with the truth sometimes. But that doesn't, we can isolate the things that we find wrong or maybe dishonest or whatever, but that should not taint everything she does, right? Like, so it's not like everything she does is garbage. She's doing a lot of good scholarship. Like her peer-reviewed papers are decent papers and are useful just for the bibliographies alone. And that work, that makes, like, that's what scholars do. And that's what makes the papers useful for that purpose. But you do have to read them critically and really fact check some of the stuff that she does, and some of her logic too. Definitely vet it. But then that's true for a lot of scholars. So I could talk about a lot of really terrible scholarship that nonetheless passes peer review, but it's still way above the sort of crank stuff that's being poured out on the internet and all the stuff that isn't passing peer review, right? So she deserves credit for that.
Yeah, definitely. And I saw some people asking, I'm drinking Chattanooga whiskey tonight. That everybody loves to know what I'm drinking for whatever reason. But this is I believe it's called like a dragon cup or something like that. I don't know. It's got a nice little dragon on it, but it sits just like this. Yeah. And so awesome. It's nice, and it just relaxes right there, and it's pretty easy to hold and everything. Although I do find that I have to purse my lips a little bit more than normal. So because just the opening's a little bit smaller than I'm used to.
I'm being lame. I'm just having Malbec. Malbec, that's it. Chilean Malbec, that's what I'm having.
Whatever you like. I mean,
yeah, it's a relaxing thing. Now that because I don't know if people realize I live up in the mountains of California, Southern California, and we've just gone through about a week of serious blizzards. So we've got 3 to 4 feet of snow at its peak. It's starting to melt, so we're probably down to like 2 to 3 feet of snow right now. But I literally had to. I actually couldn't get my four-wheel drive vehicle. I couldn't get it out. It was so buried in snow and ice. I tried chains. I tried everything. I had to wait for things to melt a little bit, just enough to actually. It took me hours of digging and it was astonishing. But eventually I could do it. And then this sort of 4x over like all of this rough, like multiple feet deep of snow to get like 50 feet to where it's been plowed. And then I just parked down there. So my car is now parked down there. And then we had another blizzard and it's buried again. So, so we'll see. But anyway, I don't know. I've been dealing with that. So it's been nice, keeping it warm and enjoying it up in the mountains. And then I have a really good view out my office window of the snow and icicles. I had icicles today. So yeah. Anyway.
Well, I
hence the
don't
Malvern.
envy your blizzard. I don't envy the blizzard, but I do envy having snow outside your window because we like never get that here. We get tornadoes.
Yeah.
So
I moved here not entirely, but largely for the snow. I was
yeah.
gonna miss that. I hate Southern California weather. So when I moved back to Southern California, I was really sad that I was not going to have winters and not have, that. But when I found out I could get an affordable apartment in the mountains, which is pretty much the only place I can get an affordable apartment in Southern California, I was super overjoyed because then now I get my seasons and a affordable apartment, barely. But yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get to Chrissy Hansen. She's talking about the dialogue with Trypho and possible evidence of mythicists, or at least some people talking about how Jesus may have been a myth or what wasn't exactly a historical person.
Usually in the mythicist
Can you hear that, Rick?
I can. Yeah.
Okay.
debate, the earliest reference people will try and come up with for a mythicist text is the reference to "You invent a Christ for yourselves" by Trypho in the Dialogue with Trypho, written by Justin Martyr. The comment is completely taken out of context, and there's a similar comment he makes later on, which clarifies this. Trypho is very specifically talking about that Jesus is just not the Messiah, and that even if he was anointed, or even if he was the Messiah, he doesn't even know it, and he's not even relevant until he's been anointed by Elijah. And so since Jesus was not anointed by Elijah, he cannot possibly be the savior at present. This is not a reference to mythicism, no matter how much mythicists have tried construing it that way. I know of virtually no scholars who agree with this reading, except for, oddly enough, Louis Feldman. But I don't know of any others. Outside of that, just no one seems to agree with this. It's only mythicists who really come up with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
This
So
is a good
what do you
example,
think? Yeah. My initial thoughts upon hearing this, because I have looked at Dialogue with Trypho and I've analyzed several sections of it. I don't know. I kind of feel like maybe Chrissy's doing a little bit of heavy lifting with the interpretation of what's being said there, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can.
No, you're right. She's doing exactly what Christian apologists do, which is arguing backwards. She has a conclusion she wants to reach, and so she's looking for evidence to support the conclusion and ignoring all evidence against the conclusion, rather than treating it like a hypothesis that you have to test against the evidence by actually trying to disprove it and failing, right? So proper scholarship is you have this, you try to think like, well, what if I'm wrong? What would be the case? What is the alternative theory? How does the evidence support that? And so on. You would try to disprove your own theory. And then of course you did that and you were wrong, you'd find out you were wrong, right? But if you have your theory that you just has to be true, and then you're trying to force all the evidence to fit it, then you're going to always succeed. You're going to have a bad argument, but you're going to convince yourself that you're right because you aren't properly testing your hypothesis. You're doing it the wrong way around and leaving stuff out. So there are a few things in there that are odd. One that I think is and this is a key thing to look for a lot in her work, where she does this a lot, and I've some even more egregiously than this. I give some examples in my article on her articles about me on my blog for people who want to look into that. Just search Chrissy Hansen and you'll find my blog on that. But where she says no scholars agree with this, it's like what she really means is I didn't find anyone who said this, right? She makes it sound like, oh, all the scholars argue the opposite, right? She makes it sound like what she just said is the case is what all these other scholars argue for. But what she argues is the case is just what her and other Christian apologists have said. It's not like we've done a survey of the literature of scholars who've commented on this, much less like objective secular scholars and not Christian apologists. And then we have some survey of it, and we can look, all the opinions are the other way. No, there isn't any body of literature on this. There's very few commentaries on this. Very, very few people notice or comment on it. And when they do make this point, but not in the same way that Chrissy does. So If you look at Van Voorst, for example, talks about this, and Van Voorst is actually more on the fence about this, right? Van Voorst is actually more about like, well, actually, you can read it that way. The way you can read it either way, right? It's kind of like Van Voorst's take on it. And then mentioning Feldman, right? So that would be an example of someone who actually supports me. Notice the only scholar she named is someone who supports my position, not anyone who supports her position. So and she does this a lot. So like, pay attention to that in her rhetoric anytime she's arguing. You'll see these kinds of, the way she talks makes it sound like she's saying something that really is not the fact. Whereas like, if you're really charitable and you understand the context, and you think, oh, maybe she's just misstating what she means to say. But in this case, yeah, like she's making it sound like she read a bunch of scholars and they all poo-pooed this idea. That isn't what happened. Like she's just not aware of many scholars who take the position that we do. There aren't many scholars who take the opposite position because this passage just isn't talked about very often. Usually it's people approach these texts from the assumption that Jesus existed. Therefore, this has to be about the Messiah rather than the existence of Jesus. You see what I mean? Like it's people start with the assumption that historicity is the case and then interpret the text. Whereas we're trying to explain that's the wrong methodology. That's backwards. You have to actually forget your assumptions, put them aside, just read the text as it's written in context without your assumptions. What then would you assume if you were a reader of this text in the 2nd century, which is, we're talking about a 2nd century text here. What would you have thought given the context and given the knowledge and things like that, and not presupposing anything? If you do that, you get very different results. And that's what we're pointing out. And that's what Van Voorst acknowledges, that we pointed this out. Well, not me specifically, but the people who've mentioned this. That's when so she talks about if we've taken it out of context. Actually, she's taken it out of context. She's not doing a proper rhetorical analysis of the text. And this is very important because the dialogue with Trypho is a rhetorical text. It's organized according to the principles of ancient rhetoric. It has a structure. And in fact, it has the first section that includes the part that we're talking about, sets up the whole structure for the entire rest of the book, which is massive. It's a huge, long tirade. But what it does, it sets up the structure, and then the rest of the book addresses, basically what you have is you have Trypho makes a bunch of accusations, and then Justin addresses each of those accusations in turn in sections of the book later on. And Justin does it backwards. He stops the last accusation, which is also the first, because Trypho has organized it in a chiasmus. Trypho starts with one accusation, builds a few others, and then ends with the same accusation that you started with. So that's the main accusation. And so Justin starts with that one, and then Justin works his way through the other accusations. So one of those is Elijah has to anoint Elijah has to grant the power to the Messiah, and so on. That's just one argument. That's not the argument. That's one argument. And you can see that when you look at the structure of the rest of the dialogue with Trypho, because there's a whole section just on Elijah. And it's deep, deep, deep in the book, right? You have to go through a lot of the book to get there. So you have to really look at the first section, the first part of the argument after this, which is setting the foundations, because Justin relies on the foundations that he establishes on each subsequent section. So he proves one thing, and then he counts on that having been proved in the rest of his sections, right? So this is how rhetoric works, right? This is how you build an argument. So if you look at it and you follow it that way, everything Chrissy Hansen says is false. It's not a correct analysis of what's going on. And what happens is, in the first section, Trypho, this is this made-up Jew, probably meant to be a typical Jewish arguer with Christians. Trypho comes up to Justin and says, prove me your religion is true. Explain to me what your religion is. I don't know why you believe it. And then Justin tells this little story about how he met this anonymous random old man who convinced him to be a Christian. How the old man convinced him to be a Christian is wackadoo. So Justin is not an evidence-based reasoner. You see that right away. But one of the things he says, it's like, oh, well, these Christians have these words are emotionally powerful. They have to be true because it's affecting me in this emotional way. And the Christians can perform miracles. Well, they couldn't perform miracles unless Jesus was real and all the stories were true, right? This argument, by the way, is repeated by Justin multiple times in the text. So Justin is not arguing like Chrissy Hansen or Richard Carrier. Justin does not have evidence-based reasoning. He does not have historical skills. This is rhetoric, and this is very emotional, fallacious, religious reasoning, right? So Trypho says, explain to me religion. Justin says, well, this old man convinced me. And then this is where we get to Trypho says, hold on. Like, you just told me this wackadoo story. And it relates to the Gospels. It says the Gospels affected him, and so they must be true, kind of thing. References that. And so what Trypho says is, hold on, you should not be deceived, and this is word for word, you should not be deceived by false words, nor follow the opinions of men of no reputation. And he says, so basically saying, so you've been conned, like you've been sold a bill of goods. You should just be Jewish. And he goes on, he says, you should castrate yourself, not castrate yourself, you should circumcise yourself, follow the dietary law, you should follow the rules and so on and be a Jewish. That's how you get saved. And then, so when he starts with accusing him of believing false things, that he's been tricked by a false story. And then he says, you should be Jewish instead. And then he says, after that, then he says, but Christ, now he's talking about the Jewish belief, our Christ, if he has indeed been born and exists anywhere, is unknown and does not even know himself, and has no power until Elijah comes to anoint him and make him manifest to all. So that's the Jewish belief. He ends with that. And then what does he do? His immediate next sentence recapitulates his first sentence, the whole chiasmus of this argument. But you, having accepted a groundless report, invent a Christ for yourselves, and for his sake are inconsiderably perishing. So you've bought a false story, right? So that's what he's saying. This last sentence is not talking about Elijah. That's a previous sentence making a separate argument, right? So these are different arguments. These are not the same argument. And you can see this in the rest of Justin's defense against Trypho, is that he takes each of these separate accusations, treats them as separate accusations, and deals with them that way. And the first accusation he deals with is this: you've been sold a bill of goods. These are false stories, and none of this is true, right? And Justin says, well, I'm going to prove to you, as I stand here, that we have not believed empty fables. The word is actually myth, right? So we've not believed empty myth, vain myths, or words without any foundation, meaning with no evidence to back them up as being true. So we have not believed empty fables or words without any foundation, but words filled with the Spirit of God and big with power and flourishing with grace. Now notice his response is not, oh, we got all this great historical evidence. No, his response is, they're so powerful, they have to be true. And he actually makes this argument. He actually points out several times, he repeats this argument over and over. He says, our people can perform miracles, your people can't, therefore our guy must be true. Otherwise our things wouldn't work. And he says, like, we can cast out demons in the name of Jesus, and not just the name of Jesus, but the name of Jesus who was crucified by Pilate, whereas your guys can't expel demons, except maybe sometimes you can if you invoke Yahweh. And, he says, but you can't invoke David. Like, that doesn't work. The demons don't respond to David, but they respond to Jesus crucified by Pilate, right? And so this is literally his argument, that Jesus was crucified by Pilate, that this is a real story because the demons respond to it, right? This is a wackadoo argument, but this is his argument. And so he starts with this, like, we can do miracles, we have all these gifts. And his first thing is that the prophets not only predicted Jesus, his first thing is the prophets predicted Christianity, right? So his first thing is it predicted all this phenomena that you now are seeing, Trypho, that you see around you. They predicted that. And that's his first argument. And then he gets into the whole, we can perform miracles, we can expel demons, therefore this must be true. So now he's established that it's true. This is the power. This is the filled with the Spirit of God and big with power and flourishing with grace, and therefore not empty fables. So now he's established this, right? Now this is wackadoo and illogical, but this is his argument. Now that he's established that it's true, that the Gospels are true and you should believe them, then he moves into the other accusations that Trypho made. Like, there has to be an Elijah. It has to be known to everybody. We think he's unknown, and so on. So he goes through all of those, and then of course they go back and forth about, do the scriptures actually predict any of this, and so on. So there's a lot of theological argument, there's a lot of scriptural argument, but they never go back to the evidence for any of these stories even being true in the first place, except whenever Justin does go back to that, he always goes back to, we perform miracles now, we can expel demons, therefore it's true. That's his foundation for the whole rest of the book. But the point is that this shows that, yes, Justin understood Trypho to be accusing him of believing completely false stories. So Justin has to defend himself against that accusation before he can get to arguing about, oh yeah, and we believe that John the Baptist was Elijah. Oh yeah, and also we believe that he will be made known to everyone in the second coming, right? And so he has all these responses to Trypho's other arguments. But he has to start with this foundation of, why do we believe any of this shit in the first place? So when Trypho makes that argument, it is very definitely and plainly saying, your stories are completely bullshit, which means, like, he is challenging the historicity of Jesus. But it's important to note that he's not outright saying, we insist he didn't exist, right? That is not Trypho's argument. Trypho's argument is like, you don't have any reason to believe this, right? It's a more indifferent position, right? It's more like we have no reason to even believe that any of these stories you tell are true. So why should we even believe any of it, right? And including the historicity of Jesus, like why even believe there was this guy? We don't have any reason to believe that. And there's a point like way later in the argument, deep in the book, where when Justin says, "Oh, and John the Baptist was Elijah, so that fulfills the scriptures so that satisfies your requirement, right?" And Trypho says, "Yeah, but I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, yeah, but how do we know your Jesus ever interacted with John the Baptist, right? I don't even know. How do we know that?" And do you know what Justin's response is? Scripture. No, he doesn't make an argument. Oh, well, witnesses saw it, and therefore, like, and it's documented here. No. His response is, no, Scripture predicts it, so it must have happened. And then he throws in that, but demons, right? Demons respond, so it must be, right? It's like, so Justin's arguments are bullshit, but it's important to notice the rhetoric that he's engaging in here is that Trypho is very skeptical that any of this is true. And so that this is an example of, and it's not an example of saying that, no, we know for a fact that there was no Jesus, you're full of shit. It's an example rather of saying that we don't even have any reason to believe there was this Jesus. Like, you're just making stuff up, right? So it's a more indifferent agnostic position that Trypho is advancing, which makes sense for the late 2nd century, because there would be no possible way for someone in that period at that time to know that Jesus did or didn't exist, because they're 100 years, more than 100 years after the events. So there'd be no way to check or find out, basically. It'd be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. But it still means that, like, Trypho knows this, like, that all you got are your gospels. Like, why do we believe that stuff? And then that's what Justin's arguments are. And so, yeah, Chrissy Hansen is not looking at rhetorical structure. She's not looking at chiastic structure. She's not looking at the whole argument and, like, how does Justin proceed? Like, where is this Elijah argument in relation to the "you're full of shit" argument, right? So, like you have to actually study the book in the context of everything to understand what's going on here. And when you do that, yeah, this is Trypho being skeptical that there was a historical Jesus. He's skeptical of all of it, not just the Jesus in general, but of the miraculous Jesus as well, right? He's skeptical of the whole package. But the key thing is that this is just a Jew, not a Christian. So this is an example of how, no one really knew whether Jesus existed or not. That's all it really proves, right? People did question it sometimes, like they questioned it in just the sense of questioning it. It's like, how do we even know that's true? Is the way they questioned it. So we do know that happened, but it's more important to look at Christians who were doubting this, because that's way more interesting. Is that Christians who were saying that the historical Jesus is a myth is much more important. And there's another section of the video, I don't know if we'll bring it up, where Chrissy Hansen touches on this, but does not mention any of the evidence that we've mentioned on this, which is 2 Peter, crucial piece of evidence here, and Ignatius. And both of those documents can be interpreted in different ways. The Docetist is, like, they're attacking Docetists is the most usual way. But those arguments aren't very strong. They actually fall apart on inspection. And this is another thing that we're talking about. When people approach the Trypho dialogue with the assumption that Jesus existed and everyone knew it, and thus reinterpret what Justin is writing and saying based on the assumption rather than working the other way around, they do the same thing with 2 Peter and with Ignatius. They approach it from the assumption that they're talking about Docetic Christians. They don't actually question that assumption. And when you actually look at the texts, they do not track a response to Docetists at all. In fact, they appear very clearly to be responding to Christians, not only Christians who are arguing that all the stories are fake, that Jesus is a mythical story, that he has some sort of symbolic meaning rather than he's a historical person. Not only that, but these documents, 2 Peter and Ignatius, are telling their fellow Christians to shun these other Christians, right? Don't even talk to them. Like, fuck them. Like, don't listen to them. Don't talk to them. Kick them out of your churches, which tells you that they've touched a nerve, right? Like, this is a scary alternative sect that's going on here. And the other thing that's interesting is we don't have any of their texts. We only have these texts attacking them. All of their stuff was destroyed. So we don't get to hear from these other Christians. And this is all before late heresies. Like when you get to Irenaeus, late 2nd century, we're looking at late heresies. We're not looking at the stuff. And even those late heresies talk about, like, celestial Marys and celestial seeds and things like that they're very look very similar to the kinds of things that Doherty is talking about. But even that's all very late. We're looking at 2 Peter and Ignatius. We're looking at much earlier stuff, decades earlier. And it is curious that it seems to be talking about these Christians who are saying things that we don't have any examples of elsewhere. So these guys are attesting to the existence of Christians who are saying these things because they're arguing against those Christians and even condemning them. And they're really worried and scared by these Christians. These Christians are a problem. But we don't get to read anything from those Christians, and no one else talks about them. So we only get this information. The rest of it was destroyed or lost. So, and that's crucial because we can use this evidence to show that there were mythicist Christians back then, because we see the response to mythicist Christians. And this is an important point because I think we'll show a clip eventually where Chrissy Hansen does exactly the same thing I just did for the 17th century.
Yeah, and so for those of you that don't know about the 2 Peter reference or 2 Peter reference, basically in that the author of 2 Peter ends up fabricating a physical encounter with Jesus as like a rebuttal to people who say that they just follow cleverly devised myths. And then the Ignatius thing, I believe, is Ignatius actually responding to I guess a Christian heresy or something like that, where it says that Christ or Jesus didn't appear to anybody until he was shown as a bright star in the sky.
Yeah, right. And, well, that's one. That's true. That's also in Ignatius. Okay. But Ignatius also has the section where he's very adamantly insistent that you must believe in the Jesus who was really crucified by Pilate, who was really born to Mary, and really did eat with disciples, and the disciples really did meet, and so on. He's very concerned about these Christians who are denying all these things, right? So that's an important one. I do cite both of these. If people go to the Chrissy Hansen article I did on my blog, and in there I talk about 2 Peter and Ignatius. I think I drop a reference to them, and then link to my discussions of those too. And then you can follow those links to get into more detail of why I think what I do about these. And even if people are going to say, well, but you could reinterpret this stuff, the point being is that at best for the historicist position, it tracks both ways equally well. Like you can interpret it both ways. Both meanings fit the texts equally well. I think the historicist meaning fits even less. I think it fits poorly. And I think the mythicist reading fits very well. But even at best, if you push it, you only get it at 50-50, which means this, you can't say we don't have evidence of this because it looks like we do. And the only way to get rid of that evidence is to attack it with assumptions rather than admit that the evidence is ambiguous. It looks like it could go either way. And in fact, it looks a little stronger on the other side, right? So people need to reapproach this stuff without their assumptions and look at it in context for what's actually being said in the time that's being said and so on. And don't make these sort of presuppositions when you're interpreting the text.
Right. And before we move on to our next clip, because our next clip is intimately tied with this particular topic. And so just to kind of summarize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, Carrier, but wouldn't you say that this is these three sources are show that there at least were Christians and I guess non-Christians that were at least entertaining the idea of a celestial Christ, or at least a Christ that may not necessarily be based on historical evidence, or may not have any kind of evidence to support the existence of this supposed person, right?
Yeah. So the celestial details in particular are less attested. They're not clear about it, right? So saying, if these other Christians are saying that these are cleverly devised myths, what were they saying they were instead, right? So like we're not told, right? Because they don't want us to know that, right? They want those people to be shunned, right? So they're basically polemically attacking them and telling their fellow Christians to not even talk to them. So we don't get to hear what those other Christians were actually teaching, like what alternative they were teaching. We don't know. So we have to infer that from other outside evidence and context and things like that. And that's what Doherty did, and that's what I did on the Historicity of Jesus. Lataster then vets that in his book, Questioning the Historicity of Jesus. So that we can only get at indirectly. You did drop one reference to Ignatius, does have this weird reference to the star gospel. He doesn't call it the star gospel. That's just, it's some sort of gospel in which Jesus becomes a star. And it does not fit Matthew. It's not tracking It's not tracking any known gospel. We have no gospel that matches his narrative. We have hints that Irenaeus knew this gospel because he references some of the same things that Ignatius does, but we don't have this gospel. But it's in this gospel, the birth and death of Jesus are hidden. Like no one knows about it until after the resurrection, Jesus becomes this super bright star that all the heavenly hosts see. And then all the demons feel tricked and they're like, oh my God, what happened? What the hell? And then that's how Jesus gets power over the demons and yada, yada. And Christianity proceeds. But so this is a weird gospel, right? And it does look very similar to what we see in the Ascension of Isaiah. So there's that leads into that whole can of worms. I know Chrissy Hansen hates my position on the Ascension of Isaiah, but but there is overlap. There is curious overlap between the triad of Irenaeus, Ignatius, and the Ascension and this star gospel. So there's some lost gospel that these guys are referencing. I strongly suspect, I can't prove this, and I don't base any conclusions on this because I can't prove it, but I do strongly suspect that star gospel is what's been torn out of the Ascension of Isaiah. I think it was the original, and of course we're only hearing paraphrases. We're not hearing an exact, so we don't have the text. We just have Ignatius referring to it and paraphrasing it. We have Irenaeus referring to it and paraphrasing it. But I think they're referring to a gospel, I think, that was the original middle part of the Ascension of Isaiah, chapter 11. But again, like I said, I don't base any conclusions on that. I don't require that to be true. It's just a thing that I suspect. But yeah, that would get into a whole other digression. But that's what I meant when you asked about the celestial Jesus, is that we have some hints. Like in Irenaeus, he talks about the people talking about celestial births. Aaron Adair has a paper. I don't know that he's published it yet, but he's working on it. He's presented it at a conference, a biblical studies conference already, on how Revelation seems to be one of these texts. It seems to say that Jesus was born in outer space and that Mary was fled to outer space and so on. It does seem to say that, but Revelation is so wackadoo and so symbolic that it's hard to know what to take literally and what is just figurative. So I've never used it as a text or as evidence. I'm intrigued by Aaron Adair's work on it, and because I've seen it, and I think people should look for it when he does eventually publish it. It's going to be worthwhile, whether it holds up or not. It's going to be an interesting analysis of the text. But that's the kind of thing we have to do. We can only get at it indirectly because all the direct evidence has been destroyed or lost, because that isn't the sect that survived. It isn't the sect that got to decide what books to preserve for us to read them now. So, or what state to preserve them in, right? So, and we know the Christians doctored all kinds of stuff. We know they made up all kinds of stuff. We know they destroyed all kinds of stuff, or just didn't preserve it, which is amounts for the same thing for our perspective. And we know they didn't want to talk about stuff. Like in this case, like in Ignatius and 2 Peter, they very carefully avoid going into detail about what their opposing Christian sects are arguing. They're just polemically attacking them and denouncing them, and then telling their fellow Christians what they're supposed to believe instead. So from that, we just have to infer what the other Christians were saying, right? So we don't get to hear from that. So we have to infer things. So we have to go at things in that way. And that's because the evidence is so compromised by the extreme bias, especially the Middle Ages, and the way evidence has been preserved for us to read it.
Right. And so would you say that there would be no reason for them to mention like these possibilities or these ideas unless they were somehow at least being expressed like by a community or by people in general, right?
Yeah. And yet they still avoid, like they're acknowledging that these other teachings exist, but they avoid articulating what they are. Right. The way they respond to them is by telling their readers what they're supposed to believe instead. Right. So they're trying to hide from us what the actual teaching is. They're going out of their way to do this. The way their rhetoric is formed is they're trying to not talk about it. And they're trying to tell Christians not to talk to those Christians to talk about it. Right. Like they don't want it. They don't want it known. They're trying to suppress the evidence and the knowledge and the actual teaching. And so we have lots. This isn't the only evidence we have of Christians trying to get other Christians to not listen to things and not know things. We see that a lot. Destruction of documents, we know, like the Gospel of Peter was actively destroyed. We have direct references to efforts to burn all the copies of the Gospel of Peter, for example. So we know they were also actively destroying documents. We know they were just throwing them in the trash. We know they were altering documents, removing things, adding things, and so on. We know they were doing all that. We have tons of examples of this being regular Christian practice. And so this makes it very difficult for us to get at what was really going on, because it's like trying to understand the history of Russia, but only getting to read USSR propaganda literature, right? Mm-hmm. You don't get any other information. You can only read approved Russian propaganda and then trying to reconstruct the actual history of the USSR, right? Like that's the kind of thing that we're looking at here, is we have this extreme control of documentation of what we get to see and hear. And we have to kind of get behind that. And that makes it difficult. That makes everything ambiguous, and means that we don't have smoking guns. So we can't be absolutely certain of anything, because we're dealing in this sort of compromised information space.
Yeah. Now, Chrissy claims to have found the first reference to people not believing in a purely historical Christ or historical Jesus. And she has a quite interesting way to make this determination.
But we know that they existed. And we know they existed because of references like this. So, but yeah, one thing to keep in mind is that we have no, like from the 1600s, we don't have any actual mythicist texts. But we know that they existed. And we know they existed because of references like this in the works of Grotius. Because why are you arguing that Jesus existed as a real person unless someone's talking about how Jesus didn't exist? Like, you have no reason to argue that he existed unless that was in the public consciousness.
Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah, spot on. You could literally just run that clip.
Spot on.
You could just talk about Ignatius and 2 Peter and then run that clip. And Chrissy Hansen is arguing our position. That's exactly what we're saying. That's literally exactly what we're saying about 2 Peter and Ignatius. And she's right. I think like her methodology is correct here, is that in the 17th century, the fact that there are people making these arguments very strongly indicates that there were people making the other side of that argument. And also it means that they don't want us to know about that. Like, they're suppressing it, they're censoring. We only get to hear about the pro-Christian side or the pro-Catholic Orthodox side. We don't get to hear the other side. And now we do eventually later, when the Catholic Church loses control, basically, of the ability to censor. I mean, the whole failure to try and censor Galileo that was the death knell for Catholic ability to control information. And then you have the Enlightenment, and then people can publish anything they want, and the church can bitch and moan about it, and they can't stop it. Is what happens, right? So after the 1600s, then yes, that's when we start getting we have surviving mythicist texts that we can read. And Chrissy Hansen talks about the history of that and everything. But she's also right. Like, you go back 100 years and you see already one half of this argument is going on. And that tells you that, yeah, there were people arguing the other half of that argument. We just don't have any of those documents. And that's a perfectly sound way to argue. And it's exactly the way we have to argue with early Christianity, for the exact same reason, because of the control of information and the way that information has been compromised in its way to us. And yeah, we have texts just like that. We have 2 Peter, we have Ignatius. So, and I would include, the dialogue with Trypho, even though that's not an opposing Christian sect. It's just a casual Jewish doubter that is a fictional one, but I think it's meant to at least represent the typical kind of Jewish arguer that a Christian would run into, right? I think Justin wants to create this argument that people can use. It's possibly straw manning the Jewish argument. I think it would be counterproductive for Justin to do that, because I think he wants to create a manual for defeating these arguments. But as I just did a blog recently on today, current Christian apologetics, completely failing to do this. It's entirely possible that Justin is straw manning Trypho, not realizing that he's shooting himself in the foot, rhetorically. But either way, though, but Trypho is a Jew in his mind that he's interacting. But still, the fact that he imagines that there are Jews who would challenge the historicity of Jesus, who would say, "We think all your stuff is made up. You just believe false stories." That is entirely believable, and probably is the case. So there's probably were tons of people who were that kind of skeptic in that perspective. And then, of course, gradually later, we see more and more insistence that the Gospels have to be true. See, like Tertullian after this. So after the dialogue with Trypho about 10, 20 years later, you have Tertullian insisting the Gospels have been preserved they've been preserved, handed down from the original apostles who wrote them from generation to generation in these churches. So they can't possibly be doctored. They can't possibly be false, right? So this is like a really adamant defense of the historicity argument. But of course, at the time, they're arguing that it's all or nothing for them. It's either Jesus is all the magical Jesus or he didn't exist at all. This idea of extracting a plausible historical Jesus, that's a modern methodological concept. It's a rational, reasonable concept, but that's the kind of rational way we do history now. But back then, that wasn't in the battlefield of religions. That wasn't usually the way things were going. You would get more of a polemical attack, like Celsus will say, "Oh, yeah, sure, maybe your Gospels are based on some true thing, but Jesus was just another huckster. We know a lot of these hucksters, right?" Now, Celsus didn't know that. He had no evidence that Jesus was a huckster, but he just finds that as a useful rhetorical attack because there isn't any way to disprove it, right? So that's why Celsus uses that move. Why Celsus uses that move rather than attacking the historicity of Jesus, because that would be a polemically weaker argument, if you understand. So Celsus wants to make a rhetorically strong argument. And a strong argument is one that grants as much as you possibly can to your opponent, right? So that makes your argument as strong as possible. So that's why Celsus is taking that position. We'd probably know more about this if we had Celsus. We don't. We only have Origen's rebuttal to Celsus. So we have to infer what Celsus said or find quotes of him in there. But Celsus might have said more things than Origen responds to. But even if he didn't, it still makes sense for Celsus to take that position. That does not mean that Celsus had secret inside knowledge that Jesus definitely existed. He didn't. He had no more knowledge. And his only source is the Gospels, like he admits. The only information that we have are the Gospels. So anyway, you can explain and understand these things in context, but you do have to, you can make inferences based on these contexts. And I think that's why that kind of argumentation is important, and not to just come at it with a presumption and then try to make the evidence fit your presumption. That is the wrong way to come at history. And so when Chrissy Hansen is doing the one thing, she's on the right road, using the correct methodology. When she does the other thing, she's in Christian apologetics town. She's doing the exact same thing that Christian apologists do, rather than reliable scholars. And sometimes she slipped into one mode, sometimes in the other. And you just have to look for what she's doing in the argument and then fact check her. And then you'll find out which she's doing in any given case.
Yeah. Would you say, in my own survey of early Christian church fathers, it seemed like those that were arguing for the faith really weren't all that concerned with the historical nature of the faith, with Justin, he had very emotional reasons. He wasn't convinced by any kind of historical evidence or anything like that. He was just concerned with how it made him feel, or how true he thought or felt the words were, and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think other church fathers kind of say similar, not exactly, but
totally
similar stuff.
And that's when you finally get Eusebius, who's the first author we know who appears to be trying to do a documentary history of Christianity. He's the first one who says he's trying to prove Christianity is true through its history, right? Rather than just asserting it, right? But when you look at Eusebius really carefully, he has no documentation until you get to about the late 2nd to early 3rd century. Then he starts quoting all these documents. But for the first 200 years, he has nothing other than what's in the New Testament, right? So he's got the New Testament, and that's it. He has no other letters, no other administrative documents, no other accounts. He's got nothing. And so he has nothing. And if you go back further and further, it looks like no one had anything. You look at Papias. We have quotes of Papias. Papias tells us what he was told, the oral lore he was told about the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Everything he says is false. We know it's false. He's clearly, he was sold a bill of goods. He was just believing weird rumors that were completely bogus. Some Fox News, patron who just believes whatever Fox News says and doesn't says all these wackadoo things. Oh my God. But no, that's exactly what Papias is doing. But it's very clear from Papias that he had no access to information prior to his own time. So there's nothing from the 1st century. He has no documents to quote. He has no historians to quote. He's got no letters or anything. He's got nothing. All he's got is the New Testament and rumors that are clearly wildly false. And so this means that one thing that I've supposed about this, and we have Pliny the Younger talks about this, about how when he had this list of Christians someone gave this anonymous list of, here are these Christians you should persecute. And he would be prosecuting them for illegal assembly. It was like a standard political violation. It had nothing to do with Christian doctrine. It was just, you're not supposed to assemble without a license from the state. and so he goes and, basically starts arresting and interrogating these people. And he finds that they're reporting that almost everyone on the list, he says, like, most of the people on the list weren't Christians anymore. They left. Some, he said, even 20 years ago, right? Like they hadn't even been Christians in that long. And the point is, like, he had to go looking for these guys. Most of them weren't even Christians anymore. And this guy, he was basically the equivalent of the Attorney General of the Roman Empire for many years. He was the governor of multiple provinces. He was a lawyer. He'd done a ton of things for years and years and years across the empire. It's like one of the leading legal lights of the empire. And he had never heard of Christians, or he'd heard of them like in passing, but he'd never encountered any in court. He had no idea what they were accused of. He didn't know what they were supposed to be punished for, which tells us two things, like the fact that so many Christians had left by the time that he was interrogating, and that he'd never encountered them, that there were almost no Christians, right? Christianity almost died out. Like it's the quantity of Christians is so small that you have to struggle to even find them. And then when you find them, it'll be someone who left, who's not even a Christian anymore, right? And so it starts to grow after that. And we see by the end of the 2nd century, there's a significant, like they have more institutions and more personnel. But this means that I think they lost their history. I think there was kind of like this generational shift where these hucksters started pushing the historical Jesus off of the Gospels. And there's very few Christians left to push back, like enough to cause 2 Peter and Ignatius to be written to denounce them. But there weren't very many. And so it was easy to pull this con off because most of their documents were lost. Like the institutions faded out. Like by the time that Tertullian's talking about church, like the church at Corinth, I doubt that was the same church. I bet the church that Paul founded had probably gone extinct, decades, lifetimes before. And then a new church started and claimed to be the original Corinthian church, right? That's entirely possible. We can't rule that out. There's no like documentation to prove otherwise, right? So we don't know. So I think they lost a lot of their history. So in the 2nd century, they're making it all up, right? So like that's, you get Papias just making stuff up. And like the weird story about Judas, like swelling to the size of a wagon and exploding, like blocking a wagon trail. He's swelled so big because he had so many worms in his body. I'm not kidding. This is exactly what Papias says. Like they're just making stuff up, right? And so the whole history of Christianity is built on this fabrications. And we can see it all originates in these fabrications in the 2nd century. There's no documentation from the 1st century other than what we have in the New Testament. And I would say 1 Clement. I think that's one letter I think is authentic. It probably dates to the 60s AD. It's the only thing outside the New Testament we have that comes from the 1st century.
Now, to sort of change subjects a little bit here, at the very beginning of the stream tonight, you said that you had been the first one to publish a comprehensive, case for mythicism. The first one in 100 years, just about 100 years when you published, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, apparently Chrissy has some problems with that particular claim.
Yeah.
So we'll just jump right into what Chrissy has to say about the earliest, I guess, academic treatment of mythicism.
There's one more thing I forgot to mention. In 1993, we actually get arguably the first major mythicist publication in academia since basically Arthur Drew's time, and this is Jean Magne's from Christianity to Gnosis and from Gnosis to Christianity or something like that. This is published in 1993, and contrary to Richard Carrier and everyone else who tries to claim that he was the first peer-reviewed, published, systematic account of a mythicist Christianity, blah, blah, blah. No. Jean Magne did this in 1993, and it was published in the Brown Judaic Studies series. And for notes, that is an actual university series. Like, this is from Brown. Not only that, the book was endorsed by Jacob Neusner. And for those who don't know, he was one of the most well-known scholars of ancient Judaism, and also like Talmudic and Midrashic Judaism in living memory. In fact, I think at one point he was holding the world record for the most publications with his name on them.
Yeah. So Jean Magne, maybe. Is
French.
name?
In French, yeah.
Okay.
Magne. So half of that is false. Everything else is true. The stuff about Neusner and the peer-reviewed status of the publication. Trivial thing, it's not. I don't think it's a big criticism. Is the 1993 book is actually a republication of separate stuff that was published in the late 80s. So the 1993 publication it's all in one place, and it's in this particular peer-reviewed series, and it has the Neusner introduction and all of that. So 93 is a fair date to put on it, although it had been published before that, but not many years before that. But that book has never once talks about mythicism. It talks about, so there's near the end in the concluding chapter, which is like the sort of conclusion or evaluation. It spends a couple pages on the possibility that Jesus didn't exist. It doesn't argue that Jesus didn't exist. It doesn't present any case for the origins of Christianity without a historical Jesus. It doesn't do any of that. It just mentions that there's a possibility and talks about it a little bit, but it does not argue for it. None of the thesis of the book is that Jesus didn't exist. The book has nothing to do with that. It is about how the Gospels in particular, and the Christian gospel, in broad sense, has allegorical, symbolical, theological underpinnings. And so you could say that it's an argument against the gospel Jesus for sure. Magne is definitely saying that that's a myth, but that's what all historicists say today, right? Other than fundamentalist Christians. So Magne's book is not a mythicist book. It is not arguing for an alternative origins of Christianity without Jesus. It's not surveying the evidence for and against the historicity of Jesus and coming to a conclusion. It does none of that. So it isn't an example of this. It is interesting that Magne took seriously the possibility that Jesus didn't exist. I think he even mentions some of the earlier mythicist work from long ago. Maybe he didn't. I can't recall. It's been a while since I've read Magne, but no, yeah, it doesn't do any of that. So I do think it's interesting that he at least tips a hat to mythicism. That's a piece of history there. And that it passed peer review, right? That's another example that the academics do take this seriously. But since he's not assiduously arguing for it, he's just offhandedly mentioning it as a possibility. That's not really a big deal. And it's certainly not a peer-reviewed argument against the historicity of Jesus. So no one had done that since Drev's time, exactly like Chrissy says. I am the first one to do that. Now, there is an author that we could include, which is Thomas Brodie. He published a memoir shortly before mine. I think the book was 2012, maybe 2010. I can't remember the exact year it came out. That is a memoir where he talks about how he came to believe that Jesus didn't exist and how he reconciled his Christian faith with that. And he gives some examples of the evidence that convinced him. So that would be like the first, we could say, peer-reviewed attempt to argue this. But his book actually doesn't systematically argue it. He doesn't survey all the evidence for and against Jesus. He doesn't propose an alternative theory of the origins of Christianity. He doesn't explain how Christianity arose without Jesus. All he does is say there are some of these attributes of the epistles and the gospels that make me suspect that there wasn't a Jesus. And that's really all. And it's more of a memoir. It's more of a biography, an autobiography of his scholarly quest. And I do think he intended to publish a more thorough study that was an actual proper study of the question of the historicity of Jesus. But the Catholic Church shut him down. They forced him into retirement and silenced him. He can't publish anymore. So I think, he shot across the bow with this memoir got shut down. He had to decide either publish or accept a pension, and I think he took his pension, and I can't disagree with him. Like, that's what you got to do in that situation. So, but anyway, so Brodie would be more credible. Magne is not an example. Brodie would be a better example of someone who published before me. But because he didn't publish a systematic study of the evidence for and against the historicity of Jesus, he did not propose an alternative theory of the origins of Christianity without Jesus. It doesn't really satisfy the category in the way that Dreves does, or I do, or Lataster does. So that's why I don't count him in the list of peer-reviewed scholars. But it's worth pointing out that book also does exist.
Yeah, and I found that kind of hilarious there, that because it just kind of seems like almost like a personal stab just in your direction.
Yeah, right. No, it's very emotionally driven, which I think is another thing to look for, because this is another typical Chrissy Hansenism. Is she makes these exaggerated assertions in a sort of snarky way that are false, and then surrounds them with these minor true facts. Right. And then when you go and check, you find out like she's massively misrepresented the evidence. That is very common. I find she does that a lot. So often she'll make these broad, confident assertions that are not true, or are only half true, and importantly half true, not trivially half true. And so you got to be on your eye out for that. As like I said, I'm not saying that everything she says is like that, but she does that a lot, enough that you really do need to check her. And in some cases, it's hard to do. Magne's book is not easy to get. Right. So it could be hard. And I can't even remember, well, his earlier work is in French, but, so it can be difficult to get at, let's put it that way. And how do you verify? Like, you got to read the whole book to verify the claim. This can be done. But most people aren't going to do this. And so it's easy to get away with these kinds of exaggerated false claims, relying on that people aren't going to fact check you. But I think people need to be responsible, and you just have to fact check people. And I encourage people to fact check me, like, do it, because then you'll get a sense of like, how often am I inaccurate or accurate? You'll get the same sense for Hansen, and then you'll be able to compare which of us is usually telling the truth about things.
Yeah, I mean, just riffing off that for a second, whenever I go to write a response to a video or something like that, I mean, I do use you as a good source, but one thing that I always do, not only for you, but for anybody else that I look at, I always make sure to check the footnotes, check the references, and then make sure that I understand, like, where you're getting this from, that I can find it and everything like that. Because
have I described it correctly? Does it say something that's actually damning that I've left out? You should definitely check that stuff. It is worthwhile checking that stuff. And that's how you get a sense of a scholar's reliability, is if you keep checking them, you start to get a sense, right? Like if they check out a lot, well, then now you're looking at a reliable scholar. If you start catching them, fudging a lot, well, now they're a fudger. Right. So like you start to get a sense of like the general reliability of a scholar, the more you fact check them. And I highly encourage doing that, especially if you're going to do these kind of like videos that you do, where you really got to have it, right? You better have the goods to succeed at it. And you do that really well, which is, I've used that as an example, that how well you do that is exactly how people should do that. I've used other YouTubers or podcasters as examples in some of my blogs on critical thinking. Sean, the YouTuber Sean, is an example. He doesn't do this stuff. He does political and social commentary, but his skill at debunking and his carefulness with argument, making sure he's fact-checked things and so on, rather than just trusting a scholar based on the prestige, which is this whole argument from prestige problem that I'm seeing happen a lot. Rather than trust someone just based on their prestige, trust someone based on their proven record of reliability. And the only way to have a proven record of reliability is if you doubt them enough to fact check them enough that you can establish what their record is. And so I definitely encourage that people do that. And that is the point of having the footnotes and having the careful documentation. I've made this point a lot about other mythicists who don't publish under peer review. Not all of them, but some of them, the worst ones especially, don't carefully demarcate which claims they're making are facts and which are just theories or speculations. And then they don't give you a breadcrumb to check, right? They'll just make these wild assertions and then move on. And then you're like, well, how do I check that, right? Like, I need a reference. I need to be able to fact check what that is. a good scholar will carefully distinguish in their text between hypothesis and fact, between a conclusion that is argued for and a conclusion that is just plainly obvious, right? They'll make that distinction very clear to you. And then when they're talking about an argument or a conclusion, they'll give you the argument or conclusion so you can vet the logic yourself. And when they're talking about a fact, they'll give a citation so that you can breadcrumb it. You can follow the citation and find out if that fact is a fact, right? That's what good scholars do. And a good scholarship will do that consistently. Bad scholarship won't do that consistently. And that is one way to actually tell the difference between good and bad scholarship when it comes to formal academic arguments and papers and things.
Yeah, and I was going to bring this up because it's something you gave me right before the stream. And this kind of fits in well with what we're talking about here.
Right.
I'm wondering if you can kind of explain what we're looking at in this document.
Yeah. Can people read that? I guess they can if they have the whole screen up. Yeah, this is one of the papers that I address in the article I did on Chrissy Hansen's articles. So you can find my discussion of it on the blog with further links where I discuss the issues. So if you want to deep dive this, you can go to that article and find all the links there and deep dive it. But this is an example of how Chrissy Hansen tells lies. So she'll say, like right here, that so we're talking about the rank Raglan. We got to fill people in if you don't know what we're talking about. The rank Raglan archetype, this hero type, is this 22-point feature, sort of this typical hero that keeps getting replicated. So a lot of mythical heroes have these 22 features, or at least have more than half of them. So there's a lot of mythical heroes get conformed to this type. I use this on the Historicity of Jesus to create a database that we can actually get statistical results with. How often are historical people conform to this type? And the reason I use this type is because it's very clear. It's hard to be in it accidentally because there's so many points that you have to satisfy. And then there's so many who satisfy it. It's very unusual, and it has like 15 members. A lot of mythotypes don't have that many members. That's actually a really large number for when we're working with ancient history and material. So that's actually a large set for our purposes, for ancient history purposes. You have to use a large margin of error here, but you can actually talk about how often did that happen. So it gives you a useful proxy for how often do historical people get that mythologized. Not necessarily how often do historical people get turned into a rank Raglan hero, but how often do they get mythologized so heavily that they end up like a rank Raglan hero, something like that. And so someone who's been made a rank Raglan hero, you can say, wow, most people who were turned into rank Raglan heroes didn't exist. And that's a fact. You can look at the documentation, I document it and so on. Most, if not all, the people we know, other than Jesus, and Jesus is the variable, right? So we're not going to make any assumption about whether Jesus is one or the other, but all the others, we have no evidence they were historical people. We have a few people who were historical who come close. So like Mithridates and Alexander the Great, they don't score over half, they score under half, but they come close. So that's why I actually allow for a certain number of historical people to have satisfied it, even though we don't have any concrete examples of them doing so. I allow 1 out of 3 could be historical persons. So I'm already accounting for the possibility that Mithridates and Alexander fit the type, even though they don't really, but they come close at least. So it's an example of how that can happen. And I talk about other aspects of this, like there's tons of aspects of the argument of anachronism. You can't use examples from the modern times because it's completely different historical context. You can only use examples that are pre-Christian, because after Christianity, the tendency is to make everybody conform to Jesus, and Jesus is already a rank Raglan hero, so it's just de facto they're going to be rank Raglan. So the cultural context has radically changed after Christianity becomes normed. So anyway, there's a lot of these methodological issues that Chrissy Hansen also fucks up. But this particular statement here, where she says that Lord Raglan's work has since been widely dismissed by folklorists and mythologists. And then she says, however, where it has seen a lasting impact is in historical Jesus studies, et cetera, et cetera. Now here she makes a statement. Now this, if anybody who reads this is going to think, I'm pretty sure what you're going to say is, oh, so the archetype has been rejected. The rank Raglan archetype has been rejected by folklorists and mythologists. That's what it seems like she's saying. That is false. That is not the case. If you notice the previous sentence, she ends with which he argued was based in ritual. So there's a key moment here where this is a misleadingly worded statement that's going to mislead everybody. And I think it's intentionally misleading everybody because I think Chrissy Hansen is often careless with this kind of stuff. What has been rejected by Raglan's work was his belief that the archetype referred to a ritual, a universal religious ritual. That has definitely been rejected. Nobody adopts that. And I don't use it. So it's not relevant, right? So we only use the archetype. The archetype is still fully accepted. No one has rejected it that I know of other than Chrissy Hansen. And she cites two people like in here, footnote 3. So what I did is, so first of all, I read that. And I'm like, I've read tons of folklorists and mythologists. They are all pro rank Raglan. They're all support the archetype. I've never even encountered anyone who doubted it other than Christian apologists. Right? It's like James McGrath and stuff like that. But actual serious folklorists and mythologists or actual, peer-reviewed experts in this field, no, the archetype is standard in the field. It's not questioned. So I was very doubtful. It's like, okay, how can, and also the first listed is Alan Dundas. So note 3, Alan Dundas. So Dundas is famous for being the person who first did a published study showing that Jesus conforms to the archetype. Right. So Dundas clearly, I'm like, there's no way Dundas said that the Raglan archetype was rejected. He's the one using it. Right. That doesn't make any sense. So I hadn't read Interpreting Folklore. So I'm like, gosh, does he say something in Interpreting Folklore that I didn't know? And so I went and got it and I looked. No, he doesn't say this. He doesn't say this at all. In fact, everything he says in the pages cited, including 231 that Hansen has put in brackets to like, oh, page 231, you really got to focus there. No, he's supporting rank Raglan's the archetype. He's totally for the archetype. He does question the ritual aspect of it. He points out that that's been rejected. Yeah, we all reject it. I don't use it, right? But the archetype has not been rejected, right? So then this is a paper about the archetype. So we're supposed to only be talking about the archetype. So that is basically a lie. That is definitely at most charitable. It is fatally misleading the way that Chrissy Hansen has worded this. I had not read Zumwalt, so I checked Zumwalt. She does the same thing. She's pro archetype and against the ritual thesis, but we all agree that the ritual thesis is not true. So the two sources, neither one of them say the thing that Chrissy Hansen is giving the impression of having said. They say the opposite. And so then what I did is I went like, okay, look, I'm going to look for rank Raglan in JSTOR. So that's JSTOR, which is one of the major catalogs of journal articles. It's not the only one, and it's not complete, but it's pretty big. It covers a lot of journals. And I searched this, and I could not find. I looked through hundreds and hundreds of articles, and I could not find a single article doubting the rank Raglan archetype. I found 2 articles that supported it, and supported it without question. They didn't say like, "Wow, this is doubted. I better defend it before using it." No, they said like, "Oh yeah, just according to the rank Raglan archetype. Here, I'm going to use that in my analysis." They just take it as rote, that it's exactly as I did, that this is just established. And I stopped at that point. Like I could have kept going, but I couldn't find any examples of scholars who've rejected the rank Raglan archetype. I only found scholars who supported the rank Raglan archetype. Dundas, Zumwalt, the 2 others that I found that I cite in the article on Chrissy Hansen. So this is an example of how Chrissy Hansen lies, and you wouldn't know unless you checked. You would have to go check Dundas. You'd have to check Zumwalt. You'd have to do a JSTOR search and find like what are folklorists saying about the rank Raglan archetype? Is she actually accurately representing what the field says? No. And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I was like, when you fact check people and you find that, and then you keep finding it, like you find it one time, okay, but you keep finding that happening over and over again. And there's a few other examples that I give in my article. That starts to indicate that you're looking at an unreliable scholar. Even if a lot of the other stuff they're doing is solid, you now know that you've got to doubt them. You got to fact check their shit, especially if it looks suspicious or convenient. Anyway, that's just an example of what I think
Right.
Chrissy Hansen does. And like I said, not everything she does is like that. It's just she does that enough that it's a problem. And that means you do need to fact check her like probably all the time, I think, before relying on anything she does.
Yeah, I mean, just in tonight's live stream, we've seen her do it with Trypho, or Justin Motter's dialogue with Trypho, and then the example with the rank Raglan. And I feel like it's what I've noticed, at least in my conversations with people on the other side of the issue, is that a lot of times it seems like people favor misrepresenting like what's actually being said or argued by a certain paper or journal article or text, like textual evidence. That seems to be like a running thing in my experience.
I'm lately, the last like 5 years, I've turned my practice. I used to just debunk things, right? But in the last about 5 years, I've switched to not just debunking false claims, but analyzing the methodology of the false claim. Like, what did they do that got them this false result? And I'm starting to notice patterns when people, cranks, Christian apologists, political apologists, conspiracy theorists, they all use a similar toolbox of methods. And I'm starting to gather these together. And I've got a lot of articles in my blog giving examples. And well, 3 of the very common principles are very typical of all apologetics, all conspiracy theory arguing, all bad scholarship, all crankery, is first, rule 1, straw man. So rather than steel man, rather than make the opponent's position as strong as possible and then address that, you distort the position and make it weak so it's easy to attack the weak version, which is not the real version. So straw manning, you first do straw man. Second, you conceal evidence, leave evidence out. So you don't do a thorough test. You don't go look for evidence against your position. You don't go look for evidence supporting your opponent. Things that are inconvenient or that will change the equation, you leave out. And usually they'll just leave it out. Sometimes they'll outright lie and say it doesn't exist. But one way or another, you'd leave out key evidence that would reverse the conclusion. And this I have, for people who are interested, look for my Bayesian counter apologetics article. I show this for 10 arguments for God. Every single one of them, if you put back in the evidence that the apologist is leaving out, their argument for God flips into an argument against God. And that just shows you exactly what apologetics is doing. They're leaving out evidence to flip the evidence, flip the argument the opposite way, contrary to reality. And it hinges on this, leaving evidence out. What has been left out? Always ask, has anything been left out? Are they leaving stuff out? Is there stuff I should check here? So straw man, leaving stuff out, and then working the wrong way around. So I already mentioned that before, going at it backwards, starting with the conclusion and then making the evidence fit the conclusion, rather than treating your conclusion as a hypothesis and testing that conclusion. And to test it scientifically, that means trying to falsify it, sincerely, genuinely, competently trying to falsify it. For 2 reasons. One is, if you then falsify it, well, now you've saved yourself. Now you know, like, okay, I had a bad idea, right? You've corrected your beliefs towards reality. Or if you fail, like you try to prove it false, really sincerely, competently try to prove it false, and you fail, that is actually the only way to prove that it's likely true. So that is how you prove, that's how you get confident in something, is that you've tried really hard to disprove it. It didn't track out. And so that's how you know that it's a believable claim. So properly testing hypotheses rather than starting with the conclusion and trying to make the evidence fit it, that's the proper way to do methodology. The apologist does it the other way around. And I see Chrissy Hansen does the apologetics thing a lot. Another thing she does is the argument from prestige. She does this a lot, like, your publisher, your academic publisher, your peer-reviewed publisher is not prestigious enough, right? Christian apologists do that all the time, right? Listen, that's not prestigious enough to count. That's not how a scholar works. That's how an apologist works. Scholars say, yeah, that's a peer-reviewed thing. It's got to be taken seriously. That's a real publisher. That's not a paper mill. It's not a book mill. Like, that's a real academic publisher that does proper peer review. Doesn't matter how prestigious it is. It's irrelevant. Or arguing that some particular person is prestigious. So like she did with Neusner. Like Neusner, yeah, he's like one of the most famous Jewish scholars, like scholars of Judaism in the 20th century, right? That's true. It's interesting. What does it have to do with the point she was making there, right? Like, so it's like there's somehow the prestige of Neusner somehow makes his opinion more reliable, when opinions are only reliable or not reliable if they have the evidence, right? It's evidence or GTFO, right? So it doesn't matter how prestigious you are. It doesn't even matter if you're peer reviewed. It does matter if you have the evidence, right? So it's relevant to her argument there that Neusner was an expert and not some rando and not some crank, right? So the fact that he endorsed Magne's book didn't balk at the Magne daring to suggest that maybe possibly there wasn't a Jesus. That's relevant, but it's only relevant because Neusner is a qualified expert, right? It's not relevant because he's prestigious. His prestige is irrelevant, right? All that matters is he competent? Does he have the degrees? Does he have the background? That's it. And he does, right? So that's the kind of thing. That's another thing you see a lot is argument from prestige. This idea that your publisher is not prestigious enough, you're not prestigious enough, the people who agree with you aren't prestigious enough. Like if that's how you're arguing, you're not a scholar, you're an apologist at that point, right? And it's because we see Christian apologists, they did that all the time in the resurrection debates throughout the last 20 years, right? People who've seen like William Lane Craig or any of these other people, they often wheel out, well, this particular prestigious scholar said such and such. And who are you, right? Like that's the argument they'll make. That's not a scholarly argument. That's an apologetic argument. So that's like 4 different things to look for. And Hansen does that a lot. And it's frustrating.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up the prestige aspect of it, because that's actually what I want to go into next, because there's a sort of a section here where they, I guess this is getting more into, I guess, personal jabs in your direction.
Yeah, they do that a lot too. That's fine. It's the thing is, if you're going to do that, have the goods. Like, be right. Yeah. That's the thing. Like, do it. Just be right. Like, do the work. Like, don't be lazy and incompetent. But anyway, yeah, proceed.
Right. And it's just, I think it's so funny that you say that apologists argue from prestige and really put this high value on prestige because of who's going to be making this next argument. Wait, hold on. There we go.
My criticism of Carrier, and this, people might think this is like I'm being like too unreasonable here, but like, if you got the truth, if you have the undeniable facts on your side, why not go to get published through Oxford, Princeton? Why can't you do it? Like, why can't Carrier go to those publishers and get his book out? Is there a reason why? Did they blacklist you? I'm just saying, like when Litwa or Ehrman publish their books, they go right to the major leagues, Oxford, Princeton. Why are you going to?
It's not hard to get. It's also not hard to get stuff published, and you can have all sorts of radical views and have them get published. I have documented all sorts of mythicist material published.
Yeah, you do it all the time. That's what I'm saying.
But I mean, I've also found, aside from me, and I do not have any. I have no credentials in New Testament literature.
It doesn't matter.
I have a BA in creative writing.
But you're doing the work. You're doing the research. Yeah. That's what matters.
If you put in the work and you put in the effort, you can get it published.
But do you want me to tell you why I think he's not doing it? Because when you say that Philo writes about a Jesus, that angel, that's not going to fly at a real academic press. Sorry, just isn't.
In fairness to Sheffield, also.
Sorry, there's only just a few seconds left. You want me to finish it out?
No, go ahead. Yeah, finish it out.
So to Sheffield Phoenix Press. From what I have been told down the line is that there were some troubles going on behind it.
I believe it.
I don't know the specifics, and I know I and others have attempted to email them about this. Anyways.
You know, it's I find that last little part right there where Neil is like, oh, I believe there were troubles at Sheffield Phoenix, when the big Richard Carrier video that he put out, he actually cut the piece where he was shit talking your on the historicity of Jesus and its peer review process. He cut all that out because he was like, yeah, I don't have the information for that. And now he's like, oh, I totally believe it. Hook, line, and sinker.
That's unfortunately Neil's shtick, right? Is that he forgets things that he said 5 minutes earlier. That I caught him doing that a lot. I caught him doing that live when we did the reconciliation video that was supposed to clearing the air, I think was the video, where mid argument in there, I catch him doing this, like forgetting a thing he said like 10 minutes ago in the same conversation. He forms a belief and he sticks with that belief. And then if he's ever shown evidence the belief is false or not believable, he might agree at that moment. But then 10 minutes later, a day later, a week later, he's back at the Mott and no longer, back at the Bailey rather than defending the Mott. Like he forgets, right? He just sticks with his weird beliefs and he doesn't have that real respect for evidence. Like the evidence doesn't really move him. It might move him for a moment, but then he'll forget that evidence convinced him he was wrong, and then he'd go back to what he was saying. And so he does that weirdly a lot, like to the problem that I actually worried about that. Like it's very strange for someone to act that way. But yeah, you're right. That's good to point that out. Yeah, that's all bogus rumors. So that was all like fake rumors made by shit talkers based on no evidence whatsoever. And so it's very irresponsible of like Hansen to actually just believe this and say this, and like rather than pointing out and say actually those are just unverified rumors. She even says I tried to verify them and failed. Yeah, and in truth, the reality is Sheffield Phoenix has been so supportive that they actually are now publishing this year a corrected copy of On the Historicity of Jesus. It'll correct all the typos that I've documented and a few other minor, easily fixed errors through it. So it'll be the corrected edition. And they've already like given me the go-ahead to produce a second edition. That will have more substantial changes, and that will probably put through peer review again. At least I would hope. That's what I'm assuming they'll do. That I haven't had time to work on, but that will happen eventually. But they've requested it. So this idea that there's some sort of like con going on with Sheffield is completely bogus. There's no basis for that. And there's even someone attempted to do this, what Hansen says, like try to email them, try to harass my publisher, literally harassing my publisher about this. And my publisher had to write them an email. I actually have that email published. It's in an article on the Flaviana, or this article about the Atwillians. I can't remember the name of that article, but look for post Flaviana in my blog, and you'll find the article because it's about this pro Atwill guy who tried to like denigrate the peer review and basically got a talking to from my publisher. But yeah, so it's ridiculous to even suggest this, right? But what I find more alarming in that clip isn't that last little stupid bit, was that Neil tried to make an argument that Hansen immediately repudiated, but didn't want to like step on it the way she should have done. And he also made the point about no academic this wouldn't be taken seriously. The Philo, it's more importantly for people who don't know what we're talking about. There's Philo of Alexandria, a first century pre-Christian or contemporary Jewish theologian who's writing from Egypt, wrote a ton of books, and he wrote even more than we have, but he wrote about the passage in Zechariah 6 verse 12, and he talks about the figure in that passage who's called Anatole, which means east or rising. And he says the rising one, that one he identifies it as this particular Logos angel that he talks about a lot elsewhere. That's the firstborn son of God and all of these other attributes. The angel is definitely the angel that Christians thought Jesus was, because they assigned Jesus all the same attributes. There's something like 9 to 12 attributes that are identical between Jesus and this angel that Philo talks about. So they definitely thought that they were the same angel. But the one thing that I've proposed, and I make an argument for it on the Historicity of Jesus, is that Philo even thinks that the person named Jesus in that passage is the Anatole, is the angel he's talking about, which means that he thought that there was a passage that identified one of the many names of this angel as Jesus. So that the angel named Jesus already pre-existed Jesus, right? Our Jesus. Now I make an argument for that. I don't say it's like an established fact. I just make an argument for it. I think the argument is strong, but that's me. So anyway, Chrissy Hansen has done a lot of attempts to like debunk this, but doing it poorly, doing the same strategy, straw manning, leaving evidence out, and then arguing backwards. She does all of that stuff with this. But one of the things that and she should know this is false, because I've written on it, and she must have known this by now. When he says that when the host says, Neil, that no academic press would publish this, it wouldn't take it seriously. It's been published under peer review 4 times now by 4 different presses. Well, 3 different presses, because Brill is one of them that's published 2 of the entries. Brill is a major international prestige. It's very prestigious. It's right up there with Oxford and Princeton. Lataster's book, the Mythicist book, which funnily they suddenly forget exists, was peer reviewed and published by Brill. So his thing, like, why can't I get it published by Oxford or Princeton? Well, Lataster got it published by Brill, so why do I need it published by Oxford or Princeton? If we're going to go by this argument that you only stuff published by Oxford and Princeton is to be believed.
Well, and
Right.
do you notice the sort of the moving of the goalpost? Because there's been a progression, because it's like, oh, nobody will publish this. There's no peer-reviewed academic stuff about this. And it's like, oh, well, now we've got 2 of these. Well, yeah, but they're not Oxford or Princeton, so
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's moving the goalpost. It's a classic fallacy. it's bullshit. And also the use of Ehrman there, which this is where their own argument comes to bite them, because very conspicuously, Ehrman not only didn't publish Did Jesus Exist, his only book defending historicity, he not only didn't publish it with Oxford or Princeton or any prestigious academic publisher, he didn't publish it under peer review at all. It's just a pot market book, right? So we have Carrier and Lataster, who are peer-reviewed books by major biblical studies presses. Sheffield Phoenix is not trivial. Brill is super major. Like, if prestige matters to you, well, they've nailed it. Like, Brill is it. But historicity, zero. They can't get it published. Are we supposed to argue, well, they can't get it published? They're getting blacklisted. They're getting, like, they're failing. They're failing their peer review. Historicity failed peer review. No, we're not going to make that argument. It hasn't done it because no one's done it. Like, no one's just done it, right? Ehrman didn't want to do it.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I've encountered is people talking about kind of what Neil is saying here, that you can't get mythicism through any kind of academic press or any kind of academic thing, but they complain about the whole blacklisting and or whatever. He's saying we don't actually complain about that, like because we like the mythicist hypothesis has been.
Yeah, you and I don't as much. Like, it gets complained about on the internet. Let's come up, right?
Yeah,
people have made this argument, and it's sort of true. Like, Brody is a classic example. Like, he got shut down, he got censored for daring to do this, and I think that would clearly be true for anyone in a religious institution. We have a lot of scholars who've gotten like fired for way more trivial claims than Jesus didn't exist, right? So so that's happened recently, like in the last like 5 years. There have been many like big cases of this happening, but only at religious. Yeah, Lacona. There have been others. Well, I think Litwa as well, right? So
yes, most recently I think is Litwa.
Yeah, so that happens. That's true. But usually when it's correctly framed, and Chrissy Hansen does sometimes correctly frame this, which is when you're looking at secular institutions like Princeton, it's technically secular enough to count for this point, or where Ehrman teaches, for example, North Carolina, where like those, I don't think you would get fired for being a mythicist, like at all, right? I think there are ways that your peers could punish you and make your life difficult, but they couldn't get you fired. However, that's what I believe. I do. Not only do I think, but I also know that a lot of these scholars perceive it to be otherwise. And a good example is Paul Davies or Philip Davies. Philip Davies? It's a Davies. I'm forgetting. There's a Paul Davies and a Philip Davies. I think I mean Philip Davies. You can find it on my website. Look for Davies. Davies.
Philip. Sorry,
Philip,
I've got that post pulled up right here, and I'm actually going to put it in the.
Yeah. So Philip Davies was corresponding with both me and Lataster before he died. And he came out to us as a mythicist. He said, I'm skeptical, at best agnostic, right? And but he said, like, I don't, and he was retired, like he couldn't even be fired. But he said, like, it would cause too much grief, like people would harass and trouble him, and like it would cause like hits to his reputation and things like that to come out as a mythicist. And so he could only be outed after he was dead, when he could no longer be punished. But he wasn't worried about being fired. But he did perceive that there would be backlash and harassment and stress and anxiety thrown on him, basically prejudice thrown at him for suggesting this. And he did, that perception kept him quiet. And that's a fact, right? So this is a reality. This does happen. I think the perception does not align with reality. I think Davies was excessively fearful. I don't think the consequences would have been as bad as he thought they were. But of course, it's the panopticon, right? Like, all you have to do is believe that the consequences will be bad, and that's enough to shut you down, right? Enough to steer you to talk about other things, to avoid the topic, to treat it with kid gloves, see it as a third rail. So creating that atmosphere is a problem. And this was happening right at the beginning when I first published, and Ehrman came out saying, like, no one who thinks this can get hired anywhere, which is a veiled threat, right? Mm-hmm. He outright said that. And James McGrath agreed with him. Like he says, yeah, you'll get fired. You won't get hired. Like if you do this, it's like you're basically trying to use the ad baculum, right? You're trying to say that you're trying to tell to everybody else they can't be mythicists or they won't get hired. That's coercion, right? Like that's exactly they're trying to create the perception that there's this backlash. And that's exactly what happened when Thomas Thompson came out with his peer-reviewed defense of the fact that the Moses and the patriarchs were not historical. Everybody tried to destroy his career, and then everybody told everybody else that if anybody sides with him, they're going to go after them, right? Like, so it became that kind of atmosphere. Now, it was mostly perception more than reality, and gradually over time, as younger generation came up of scholars and they didn't buy into this prestige economy argument anymore, and they just seriously looked at the evidence and they said, actually, he's making kind of a good case. And then within about 20 years, his view is now the mainstream, right? So, but at first he was treated exactly like I'm being treated and exactly like other mythicists are being treated. It's the exact same story. It's the playbook coming out all over again. So I do make this point, but I do think it can get exaggerated, this idea that, oh, you'll automatically get fired. I don't think that's true. I also don't think necessarily that you'll be punished for it. I do think the difficulties could be created for someone if they come out, but they have to be ready to face those difficulties. And the analogy I give for this is I did a series of reviews on female philosophers many years ago, atheist philosophers, so women who were atheists and professional philosophers. And I did these reviews of the interviews. I did these interviews with them. They're published on my blog. But there were a number at this time. This was like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly. At that time, I had a number of women who turned me down because they explained to me pretty much the same terms that I'm already taking enough shit for being a woman in philosophy. If I start putting a target on my back by being an outspoken atheist as well, that doubles the amount of shit I have to deal with. And so they would rather just do the epistemology or whatever other things they're doing. They don't want to be known as like the atheist philosopher, because being known as the woman philosopher was already a problem, and they were facing so much prejudice from that. And it's not like they're being fired because they're a woman. It's just they're dealing with a lot of shit. There's a lot of problems, not being taken seriously, that kind of stuff, and being harassed more, being criticized more. And so coming out as an atheist would double that, right? And so it's just why double all your grief when you can just do the things you want to do and you just stay away from that issue. And I think the same thing happens with historicism. I think there's a lot of scholars who might have their own opinions about it or don't, and they know that to have opinion, they got to research it. And so researching it is work. I don't care about that enough, and it's going to cause grief that I'll have to deal with. Why to deal with the grief? I want to go study my own little thing. I don't need to deal with it. So I do think this sort of hostility, this sort of mocking of mythicists, this denigrating them, this sort of saying they can't get hired, saying they're cranks, saying they're crazy, all of that stuff creates a social atmosphere that creates a disinterest in wanting to touch the subject, rather than saying, yeah, this is serious, you should take this seriously, but I think it's wrong. That attitude would actually allow scholars the breathing room and freedom to be more honest and open about what they think about this, and to spend more time looking into it rather than avoiding it as a third rail issue. So by the critics of mythicism turning it into a third rail issue, they are creating the very phenomenon that they are complaining about, essentially, right? So I do think that that's real, but I do think on the internet it often gets exaggerated, the degree to which someone can be punished or fired for this. But I do think the atmosphere exists, and I do think it's people like Chrissy Hansen who are creating that atmosphere, and I do not think that that's ethical, and I think that is a problem in the field.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious. One of the highlights of this section was the fact that Chrissy made it very obvious that she's not an expert in this, but yet it seems like Neil and others treat her as an expert in this particular area of the historical Jesus question. I remember at one point, I believe she was supposed to be putting out a comprehensive rebuttal on the historicity of Jesus, but I don't know what ended up happening to that effort. But I think that she ended up giving it up.
I'm not going to assume she's given it up. I'm still waiting for it. I would like to see it. But I did tell people that I'm only going to read it if it's peer reviewed. And so I want to give her credit for publishing the articles she has under peer review. Doing that like keeps her disciplined enough to be hitting that bar. I think that's worthwhile. Even though I think she's wrong, and I think she's dishonest in a lot of these papers. She's at least hitting the minimum bar of peer review, and that's the whole point of peer review is to tell people that you should take this at least seriously, even if it's wrong or whatever. It's at least saying this isn't crank, this isn't like bullshit. You should at least look at it and interact with it. It's worth your time, right? That's the point of peer review. And so if she's going to do a critique of On the Historicity of Jesus, I want her to get it peer reviewed, and so that it can be the peer reviewed response to OHJ, right? Because we don't have one of those yet. Now, ideally, of course, we would like that to be done by someone who can't be denounced as an amateur. It would be better if we had it like a scholar from the academy, who, you know, someone who's an actually established professor or something like that, do the book. I would prefer that. But if all we're going to get is the best steel-manned Hansen version of it that can get through peer review, I'm all for it. So I've been waiting for it, and I hope it happens someday. I'm suspect from all the previous work I've seen that it's going to be deeply problematic and have a problem with the truth quite a lot and misrepresent the things I've said, leave evidence out, use fallacious arguments and things like that. All the things that she's doing in her peer reviewed work already. I fully expect that, but at least we would have it so then we can say this is the best that historicists have, right? And I've always wanted to be able to do that. Say, here's On the Historicity of Jesus. I was hoping Bart Ehrman would do it, but he didn't. He chose not to publish under peer review. I suspect he did it because he didn't take it seriously enough and didn't spend enough time on it. I think he just wrote it in like a weekend or something. Like, it's really bad. But no, I was hoping I could say, like, here's the best mythicists you got. Here's the best historicists you got. You can read them and compare them and you can come to your own conclusion. Like, that's what scholarship should be for the public. Like, it should be like that. But no one has done this. No one has filled in the other side of the equation yet. And I've been waiting for that. Hansen was the only one that was even claiming to work on it. Other scholars that have been asked have said that they're too busy doing other things. Like Mark Goodacre, for example, I think would be a perfect scholar to be doing this. But he wants to do other things, right? This isn't an issue that interests him enough to do the work to create a book on it. But I do think he would produce one of the best books there is on this. Like, it would be the steel man of the historicist position. So I'm hoping for this, hoping someone will do this. But we'll see.
Well, and I feel like this section that we just watched, and we're about to move on to a similar topic as this, but I kind of feel like this section was a little bit of a roller coaster because you have Neil coming in like really strong, like, why can't you get it published at Oxford or Princeton? And then Chrissy comes up behind him and was like, anybody can get published anywhere. Like, I'm not an expert and I have peer-reviewed journal articles and I'm published places. So it's kind of like Princeton, Oxford, anybody can do it.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, you know, it's really weird.
Two completely opposed, completely fallacious arguments. Yeah. And both completely missing what they should be saying, which is that prestige doesn't matter. Peer review matters. And so that's what they should have said. And they should have pointed out, Chrissy should not have let the whole Jesus is the natural eighth point slide, because that has actually passed peer review 4 different times. So the Neil's claim that it would never pass peer review is like, no, it has multiple times, dude. What do you need? Right? So but letting all the truth slide and then responding to a fallacious argument, not by rebutting it, but by offering an opposing, completely equally fallacious argument, was kind of amusing. And to see that happen. And to be fair, again, like, we're picking little clips. This is about 4 hours of material. So we're focusing on the things that we have critique of. But not all the videos were full of this kind of stuff, but it does come up from time to time. And that's why we're singling it out.
Well, yeah, and I've tried to, I don't know if people have noticed, but I've kind of let it trail on a little bit and have stuff before it, because I'm not trying to take anybody out of context or anything like that. So I feel like I've got a nice padding around it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but speaking of prestige, our next little topic here, which this next topic, it's going to be our last topic for tonight. Rick, I've got to get you on again because there's so much more to cover.
Yeah.
But it's on this whole idea of prestige. peer review and like the journal articles and all this other stuff.
Oh yeah, okay.
Because like when I first started having or getting involved in this discussion, it was all about, well, this isn't peer reviewed, or this hasn't passed peer review or anything like that. And now the conversation has flipped into like they get really triggered whenever you're like, oh, well, no, this is actually peer reviewed.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
This has gone through the peer review process.
First, they constantly argued that it's not peer reviewed. You don't have peer review. You haven't gotten it peer reviewed. We go and get it peer reviewed, and now they complain that we keep pointing out that it's peer reviewed. The reason we keep pointing that out is because you kept claiming that it wasn't.
Right.
So for them to complain about us saying a thing that we have to say, you only have to say because they're the ones who are arguing against it, arguing the opposite. That's really frustrating and really, kind of shameless and hypocritical. But you're right. Yeah, they've completely switched the goalposts, flipped them around. As soon as we get something peer reviewed, now we should never mention peer review. Stop mentioning peer review. Peer review doesn't count for anything, etc. No, I think that's disingenuous and also a touch unethical again as well.
Yeah, I remember Chrissy in one of these interviews. I don't think it's in any of our clips, but she said that like if it's good, or maybe it was Neil. I'm not sure which one who said this, but one of them said that if your idea is good enough, or your paper's good enough, or your book's good enough, it doesn't matter if it's peer reviewed, because it should be like just blatantly obvious that you're correct about it. And it's like, it only matters because of the bitching and complaining that y'all do about it. Like, that's the only reason why it ever has mattered.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
in any case, and that's not to say that I think the peer review process isn't important. I think it is, even though it can have its flaws sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, there's crap that's past peer review. That's true. But no, it does set a bar that excludes a lot of stuff. So you can't say that this is rando stuff that is completely contrary. You can't say what Neil said, which is that no academics would take this seriously, right? Peer review literally is telling you academics are taking it seriously, right? Because the peer reviewers are academics. They're actual vetted, qualified professionals, experts in the field, and are saying, yeah, this meets the standards of the field. This you should take seriously. They aren't saying necessarily, they don't have to agree with a thesis. They can disagree with it. But if they find like errors or flaws or gross mistakes and things like that, they will point them out and either reject it or make sure that they're changed before it gets published. So peer review is exactly, the point of it is saying that this is something that you should take seriously. So for Neil to go along and say that, oh, it's, no one would take this seriously, that's the whole point of peer review, right? And so, and that's why we point this out. So people like him keep saying academics will never take this seriously. We respond with, it's peer reviewed, right? That means it's being taken seriously. And then he complains that we're pointing out that it's being taken seriously by academia through pointing out that it's peer reviewed. Like this is the sort of ridiculous loop that they're creating here. And it's just disingenuous and bullshitty. And I really wish they'd stop that kind of stupid shit.
Yeah, me too. But here's our next section on this particular topic of I guess publishing through a certain journal of higher criticism.
Yeah.
By the way, this journal of higher criticism is basically just a blog with a cool name, because he's giving out PhDs to Ralph Ellis. First of all, journals don't give out PhDs to begin with. That's not a thing. So I just want to crush that real quick. Journal of higher criticism. Sorry, our Price, but I'm just being honest, and I'm right. That.
I can't say much. My first ever article was published in
Look, I think
criticism.
that was a good time for it, though. But
yeah,
I'm sorry, I just got a remark on this. Because Neil goes in, it's like, it's just a blog with a cool name. They grant degrees. What the fuck? And then Chrissy's like, I can't really say much because I got mine, published through
her
there
first article,
too.
yeah.
Yeah, and then Neil's like, well, there was a good time for it. So, there's
make note of this.
immediate
Make note of this.
backtracking there.
When Neil says there was a time when it was okay. Now, Chrissy published years and years after I did in JHC. So Neil is saying that when I published with JHC, that was the good time when it was like reliable, right? And this will be relevant because there's going to be a foot and mouth shortly. So do you have another bit of that clip?
Oh, yeah. I stopped it about halfway through, so I'll let it continue.
That shit has gone downhill ever since.
Yeah. So the Journal of Higher Criticism becomes a hotbed for mythicist stuff. George Albert Wells publishes in it. Earl Doherty publishes in it. Jay Raskin does. It also becomes a hotbed for republishing older material, again, including from Nazi sympathizers.
Of course. Are we surprised now after this 2 hours of that?
No, never be surprised by anything that happens in mythicism. It's wild. And then also becomes
they don't name anyone.
Richard
They don't
Carrier
name who they're talking about, right? So, but go on, yeah. I
starts publishing
go ahead.
his early material as well.
Where else are you gonna go?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I also published in JHC. Where else are you gonna go? Now I published years before Chrissy Hansen, so Neil has really shot himself in the foot on that argument. He's so invested in this JHC as garbage, while against his guest who's actually published in JHC, trying to say it's not that bad. I personally do not think Journal of Higher Criticism has a high peer review standard. I have a particular reason to believe this. That's a whole long story. I don't think it's that reliable a journal, but I only discovered this after the fact. But it's also worth pointing out that its entire purpose, the purpose of the journal, is to publish not just mythicism specifically, but any kind of like out of the norm criticism of the Bible. So claiming that it's a hotbed of mythicism is kind of silly. It's like saying a journal about apples is a hotbed of articles about apples, right? It's kind of a dumb criticism. But I think that what is a legitimate criticism is that the peer review standards at JHC are questionable. So I would not count that. Now, I didn't know this. So it's like later I came to realize this. I'm deeply suspicious of the reliability of that journal. Nonetheless, when I published in it, and so Neil says, like, where else are you going to go? Like implying that I published the whole discourse there implies that I published mythicist arguments in Journal of Higher Criticism. I did not. I published nothing mythicist in Journal of Higher Criticism. I published 2 articles very, very long time ago. And both are on standard counter apologetics, the resurrection apologetics. Both articles, I strongly suspect Chrissy Hansen would entirely agree with. I don't even think they're things that she would take issue with. But they're implying that Richard Carrier could only get published with his mythicist stuff published at JHC, but I didn't even publish mythicist stuff at JHC. I'd published standard counter apologetics that both Neil and Chrissy would both say, yeah, those are actually like, we agree with those articles, right? So it's this whole sort of framing to sort of mock, but it's all void of factual basis. Like if you're going to mock something, humor isn't funny if your joke depends on something being true that isn't true, right? Like so the whole mockery is just self-mocking at this point. I just found that just kind of hilarious. I don't know if we're probably not going to stick around to do it. And there's another instance in these videos where they talk about the Jesus Seminar and the Jesus Project.
Oh yeah, I was going to try to get through that portion because that leads us to another section. So I was going to get through that.
Yeah. So that's what I meant is So that is another instance of this kind of contradictory foot and mouth kind of attempting to mock something without at all understanding the factual basis of what they're talking about. They do this here with Journal of Higher Criticism. They do it again with that other stuff.
Yeah, which I've already got that queued up, that particular video, so we can go on ahead and jump right into it. I really didn't like in that section how they were trying to loosely connect the publishing of Nazi or white supremacy.
Chrissy Hansen does this a lot. She likes trying to defame mythicism by being Marxist, being Nazi. That's largely bullshit.
Yeah. Okay, so our next little section here is talking about the Jesus Project at CFI, but also the Jesus Seminar that was going on there for a while. So let's see what they got to say about that.
Yeah, let's stop at the Jesus Seminar, then we'll get to Jesus Project. But yeah, shoot.
Okay.
The Jesus Seminar collapses for the most part, and then there is
Okay,
so yeah. The Jesus
really
Seminar
quick.
collapses. First of all, the Jesus Seminar is not a mythicist project, so I don't know why they're throwing that in here. The Jesus Seminar is a historicist project. They were trying to construct a historical Jesus. There might have been some mythicists or doubters or agnostics in the Jesus Seminar, but that wasn't its project, and that wasn't what it published or anything like that. But the idea that it collapsed is false. It never collapsed. So the Jesus Seminar was a specific project of the Westar Institute. And the Westar Institute formed the Jesus Project to analyze, for the purpose of analyzing the Gospels, to say, like, what scholarly consensus can we reach about what is authentic and what is not authentic. And they did, their first project was the sayings of Jesus. And that was the thing that like freaked everybody out, because that actually started the trend that has now become mainstream of deeply doubting the authenticity of the sayings of Jesus. So now everybody does that. Ehrman does it. Everybody's on board with the Jesus Seminar now, except Christian apologists, right, who don't like that conclusion. But that's what the Jesus Seminar did, and it did the Gospels, and then it did the book of it did the Gospels, and then it did the book of Acts. So then it became, from the Jesus Seminar, it became the Acts Seminar, and then once it completed Acts, it went on. It split into two. And it did God and the Human Future Seminar, and they did the History of Christianity, or I think it's the Early Christianity Seminar. And the Early Christianity Seminar has just published its report, so it's the official report is out. That published in 2022. So, and the Jesus Seminar itself kept going right up until the Acts Seminar started, right? So it didn't collapse; they finished, right? They finished the project, and they moved to the next project, and then they did the Acts, and then they did their next project. And they're still going strong. And it's worth pointing out that I am a fellow of the Westar Institute. So technically, I am a part of the Jesus Seminar. It's been renamed because it's doing different things, because it completed the project, right? So this idea that it collapsed is silly. It's doubly silly, especially because they're not attacking mythicists. They're attacking what has become mainstream scholarship, historicists, right? And so it's just weird. That struck me as very odd, that line, like it collapsed somehow. Like that's a very irresponsible and uninformed historical way to describe what happened to the Jesus Seminar. So anyway, so that really freaked me out. When I only noticed that when you played that back, or you pointed it out to me after, and then I noticed, oh my God, that one sentence, because I focus on what we're going to look at next. But I missed that one sentence. But that one sentence, just that whole sentence, is ridiculous in and of itself. But anyway, let's proceed with the rest of it.
Attempted revival, which is the Jesus Project, and it's got Frank Zindler and Robert Price, Herman Datering, and a bunch of others. Basically, it becomes a hotbed for mythicists again, which is really strange, and it becomes really publicly notable for that. And then it just fails to take off, and
or the
after
other one,
a single volume, it collapses.
It has two pillars holding it up: mythicism and Roman provenance.
Yeah.
I don't get what Neil is talking about there.
I don't know what he was talking about with Roman provenance.
I mean, I don't. Sounds like a reference to Atwill, and that had nothing to do with the Jesus Project. So I can just assume that Neil doesn't know what he's talking about. I imagine Hansen knows a little bit more than Neil does on this. Let's hope that Chrissy knows more. But no, it collapsed. Right? Is the whole. I don't know what happened to it. It's strange. I don't know what happened. That's all a weird way to describe what happened. So the Jesus Project was started in 2007 by the Center for Inquiry. It achieved its first conference in 2008. And I don't know if anyone remembers something that happened in 2008 that's kind of a big global deal. And I referenced it earlier. Yeah, the collapse of the global economy. So Center for Inquiry, by the beginning of 2009, like by the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009, the Center for Inquiry and Paul Kurtz and all of his charities had literally lost like something like half their endowment. Like they got hit. And because a lot of endowments did, a lot of charities got fucking slammed because the economy, the value of stocks plummeted, the value of real estate disappeared. So the huge hit a lot of nonprofits bad. And so CFI lost like half its income basically. And so they had to cut projects. And so it came down, and there was a lot of like interdepartmental politics as to whose project gets cut and who likes who. And there was Hoffman against other players in CFI, and who's going to take. It was other argument as to Kurtz is mishandling things. So who's going to take over for Kurtz? Can we push Kurtz out? Like there's all of this kind of like politicking that had nothing to do with the Jesus Project. And it was all exacerbated by the collapse of the economy and the big hit their endowment took. I imagine they've recovered since then. Like their endowment might be great now, but at the time it was crisis. And so they had to cut half the shit they were doing. And so the Jesus Project just got on the block because it was just like they just force ranked the shit they were doing, and it fell below the cutoff line. And so they got rid of it. So it's not that it collapsed. It had nothing to do with its methodology or what its project was or what its mission was or anything like that. It had only to do with economics and what happened to the global economy then. And interestingly, I personally people have complained that I've said this, but I think Hoffman is a lunatic. I think literally he's like I mean like clinical paranoia, like scary paranoid behavior. And one of the things that he would do is that because his project was taken away, he fought back by becoming a historicist and slagging off mythicists and telling lies about what happened. And he did this not just attacking mythicists, he attacked everything at CFI, everything CFI did that he wasn't a part of, and denigrated and attacked it, even though he had totally supported it before, right? Like, so just the fact that, oh, well, you fucked me over, I'm going to fuck you over, like no interest in truth or anything like that. It's all politics, but it was all in sort of this paranoid mindset of, I have to slag these guys off now. And so a lot of like the mythology of what happened stemmed from like Hoffman's like crazy behavior afterwards and becoming like a completely anti-mythicist when literally 30 days before he was a hardcore pro-mythicist, right? And we have documented statements from him from both showing this. Anyway, so that was a whole other drama. You could write a whole history book about that, I'm sure. But no, the Jesus Project did not collapse. It just got slashed. Its budget got slashed by the collapsing economy. It's really what happened.
Right. In this section, and maybe this is just my, maybe my very amateurish way of understanding what they're talking about. But when I first heard this, like I obviously didn't know that like what was it, Westar was behind the Jesus Seminar, and then the Jesus Project is a totally different organization. Just hearing this and not knowing anything about it.
Oh yeah.
It makes it seem like there's the Jesus Seminar, which collapsed, and then there's an attempted revival. It makes it seem like it's like one cohesive unit.
That's astutely noted. I didn't even think to point that out, but you're right. The way they phrased that, they make it seem like, there's this, and they make it seem like this is a mythicist storyline. This is supposed to be a video. This video we're looking at is supposed to be a history of mythicism. Why the Jesus Seminar is even mentioned, I don't even know. I don't understand, right? Like it's on the opposite side of this issue. So, but it is true that the Jesus Project was taking mythicism more seriously than the Jesus Seminar did, right? So, and so it did have like a lot of this influx of scholars like Zindler and things like that. So that is true, but implying that it collapsed for some sort of failed methodology or no one believed it, or I don't know what they're implying. They never really spell it out. That's not true. It was just its budget was slashed, and that's has nothing to do with what the quality of the work or the value of it or anything like that. I had a problem with the final edited volume from the first conference. I wrote about this on my blog. It left out half the papers, and some of the best papers that were presented at the conference are not in the book. And the ones that ended up in the book were badly edited, like they fucked them up. So it was such a slipshod thing. And I think that was probably partly because the budget was cut. And so they just sort of haphazardly basically slapped it together and didn't take care in producing it. So they didn't do all the things they had to do to get the proper conference production the way they should have done. I think they just did it because they were saving money, and they just wanted, it was the last thing they had to do, and they just had to throw it out the door, and then they could finally get rid of roll up the whole thing, and then move the money around to somewhere, some other project they wanted to do. But that's what I suspect happened. But anyway, that is what happened in that case. But like I said, it wasn't that it collapsed from some sort of like mythicist disasterism.
Yeah, and Chrissy does mention how poorly the volume that was produced from the Jesus Project was, and
Right,
basically,
well.
it's essentially saying about the same thing that you do.
Yeah, she has different criticisms that I also agree with. But and I mentioned some of my own criticisms. So if you put her criticisms with mine, like you can really trash the book. So yeah, but I think that was a product of budget cuts. I don't think it had anything to do with the quality of the product that it could have been anyway, if it had the money behind it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's going to be it for what we've got planned for tonight. Although we do have some super chats to go through here, which I've got them highlighted over here that we can handle. If anybody is interested in asking Dr. Carrier a question, now would be your time. If you want to do a super chat, please do. Because I know that people have got questions running through their heads and everything like that. We'll start off with an easy one first. I do want to say thank you everybody for watching tonight and everything like that. Thank you, Dr. Carrier, for coming on here and staying much longer than we had anticipated.
It's fine.
Yeah, Jacob B actually wants to know, how does Malbec compare to Merlot or Cabernet? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Merlot or Cabernet, yeah. Merlot and Cabernet are the most typical red wine varieties. So like if you're ordering red wine, typically they've got Merlot or Cabernet. I don't like Merlot because I find the flavor of it is largely flat, and it's a little too sweet for me. Cabernet's a little too dry for me, and also it's not as rich. Whereas Merlots Malbecs are more in the vicinity of Zinfandels. So there's a richer aroma. There's more complex flavors. Not too sweet, not too dry. So that's what I would say basically. That is a non-sommelier's opinion. I am not a wine expert. It's like your typical person who's not a professional artist. It's like, I don't know art, but I know what I like. That's the best advice I can give you on that.
And then we got the Mythic Life saying maybe it's not fair to ask students or parents to pay tens of thousands of dollars to send kids to college for dishonest scholarship. It's not fair to intimidate scholars away from academic freedom.
I mean, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
And like we were saying before, there's plenty of scholars out there that have been, I guess, scared onto this path, this Christian line that needs to be towed because of people that have stepped off of that line and have suffered the repercussions. So
yeah, if you're going to do something controversial, you have to weigh, are you ready to take the flack for it? Do you have the bandwidth and the space to do that? And so I think Ehrman, for example, can pick his battles, right? He can figure out which things that he's passionate enough that he can take the flack, spend the spoons to handle it. And so those are the battles he picks to fight. And it's worthwhile. I think he does great work in that regard when he does that. But every scholar faces that same choice. And Ehrman, of course, has much more freedom, because he's super wealthy and is extremely secure in terms of his social status and things like that. So I think he's very obsessed with how people see him, and I don't think he's worried about some sort of bad effect that will happen if he were to be a mythicist. I think he's just sort of decided which side he's on, and it's a matter of prestige for him now as to what side to be on. So I think for him, it's more a different problem than most scholars. Most scholars are in much more screwed and tenuous situations. They don't have tenure yet, and the slightest fucking thing can prevent them from getting tenure. And this can create a paranoia where you think anything. Like, so there might be, there's the reality of what will get your tenure, like prevent you from getting tenure. And then there's what you believe will prevent you getting tenure. And the latter set is a much bigger circle on the Venn diagram, right? Like, so people, because it's such a secretive, capricious, subjective thing, whether you get tenure or not, that people have these superstitions about what will block it or what will get in. And so people try to so you really have to navigate how far out of the mainstream you can go, what battles you can pick and still get away with and still get tenure and things like that. And this becomes more and more a problem as tenure becomes fewer and fewer, the scarcer and scarcer. And that's happening in academia. The tenured positions are being eliminated, so that there's fewer tenured positions to get. And so the fear is even greater. And so that this creates a sort of stress and sort of pressure to not go too far outside the box. And so that doesn't mean no scholars will, but it does mean that fewer and fewer scholars are going to. And so that's a problem. And that's not a problem. That's not Chrissy Hansen's problem. Like, she didn't cause that. That's not on her. That's just what the industry has done. And it's not just this issue that is being impacted by that. There's many issues that are being impacted by that. And we're seeing it like in stark relief in Florida right now, where you have literally people can be fired for teaching specifically the wrong thing about race theory, for instance. So we see that literally happening. Like, the government is actually saying, we are going to fire you if you teach things we don't like. That's like the most extreme version of it. But even in other states where it's not the government doing it, you still have the social sort of vague, backstabbing, mean girl world that's sort of deciding which things are a bridge too far, right? And so those things shift all the time. So it creates this sort of paranoid state of you don't know which thing is going to be too unpopular to voice to get your tenure, for example. And even tenure is not the only thing people are fighting for. Like, if you're an adjunct and you want just an assistant professor position, just that leap, which is a huge leap in and of itself, that's the same capricious, subjective, I don't know what the fuck I might do that could prevent that from happening. And so people are really scared. And so that's a big problem in academia, and it's not a problem unique to mythicism, and it's not caused by the mythicist debate. It's just a reality that also affects this debate.
Right. Yeah. And a little bit of a side note, kind of related, since 2020, the whole online, I guess kind of the online independent scholarship sort of route for, scholars to make a living seems to be a little bit more popular now than strictly sticking to academia, because, Bart Ehrman has started doing yearly paid seminars and paid courses and everything like that. And then you've got Litwa, Dr. Litwa, when he got let go from his job, he decided to be an independent scholar. It's just, I find it rather hysterical that it's perfectly fine when the historicists start doing the independent route, but it's if for you specifically, it's oh no, he can't get hired nowhere. And
I'm not even applying, right? So I'm not even applying anywhere. So it's not that I'm not being hired. I don't want those fucking jobs. Which is and that's the thing. It's two of those things. One is the industry has been wrecked, so the jobs are disappearing. They're shittier, and you, like I said, you can go online and you can find zillions of adjunct professors saying the exact same thing I'm talking about, like how shitty and fucked up and desperate and shrinking and underfunded and defunded academia is becoming. Like the industry is hosed, and it was already being hosed before 2008, but 2008 was kind of like the cliff that it just got fucked. And academia has never really recovered. Like, it's recovered a little bit from the state of the first few years after 2008, but it's remained ruined and in decline in the respects that I'm talking about. So the idea of a plum professorship with all its perks, its high pay, its security, and all of that stuff, that is a kind of almost a thing of the past. It exists, but it's shrinking. The number of opportunities to seize that is disappearing. So that is actually there's tons of this is another thing. You can Google it, how many PhDs can't get hired simply because there are no jobs for them. So this is a big problem. So what you have is you have all of these doctorates who can't get jobs because the jobs don't exist. It's not because they're shitty at their job. There just aren't jobs. And there's too many PhDs and too few positions, and the positions are shrinking in the number of them. You have that, and then you combine that with the explosion of internet technologies, which are a huge boon to productivity. And many industries benefit from this, like music. Like you can see like Lily Allen started the movement of becoming a big, successful, big money making musician without a studio, right? Because you could just go directly to your audience through the internet. And then of course, the studios had to start the studios couldn't control anything anymore. And so they started like changing the way their tactics in assigning contracts, and she eventually landed a studio album. But it's the same thing as the internet is making it possible for experts to actually go directly to their audience and not go through gatekeeping institutions like universities that are fucking everything up. And so so not only are the opportunities shrinking in one domain, they're expanding in the other. And so you should totally expect to see independent scholars moving to the internet and going directly to their audiences and making careers and making a living doing that. When we should treat that as respectable, actually. It is economically necessary, for one thing, but also like the whole idea that you need a university position to be respected, like that isn't actually a sort of fabrication of the university system itself. And it is elitist, and we do need to get rid of that. If someone's got the qualifications, can get peer reviewed, and are doing good work, they should be able to make a living at it. They should not have to have a crappy, professorship where they're teaching too many classes and have a zillion committee meetings and have no free time, right? Like the opportunity to actually seize upon the technology that we have to go directly to your audience and create your own career with the expertise that you labored and paid very difficultly to get to. I think that should be supported. I think people should support independent scholars who are doing good work, and not just in mythicism. I think just in any field, just as they should do with artists. So I do think like bypassing the gatekeepers like studios and universities and things like that is not an embarrassment. I think that's a positive development for culture, but it was caused by the sort of greed and capitalism that sort of fucked up the economy in general, as well as specifically in academics.
Yeah, well, but Carrier, as Chrissy said, anybody can get peer reviewed.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay, so next up we've got Rainbow Krampus, who says missed the first half, so no real questions. Is on the Historicity second edition going to have stuff beyond the new stuff in Jesus from Outer Space? Which you guys don't know what that looks like. Here's Jesus from Outer Space. So if you want a good introduction to the topic of mythicism, this is
that is the place to start. It's shorter, it's colloquial, it doesn't have footnotes, and it has a concordance in the back to the academic monograph. So if you want to deep dive any claim in Jesus from Outer Space, you want to go look at the footnotes and the deep scholarly analysis, you can find what page to look at in the academic study, which is on the Historicity of Jesus. So I recommend that's the best place to start, is Jesus from Outer Space. You'll probably, like, if you're really excited by this subject, you'll probably want to get the academic monograph anyway, because it's full of like interesting stuff. Even if you don't agree with the thesis or the conclusion, there's so much useful information in there on so many topics relating to the origins and development of Christianity that people will find the book valuable in and of itself. But there are a few arguments in Jesus from Outer Space that are not in OHJ. There are a few minor facts as well, but most of it's arguments, and most of it's like counter apologetics. So like there's apologetic rhetorical attack on OHJ, and so I have to frame an argument a different way to show why the response is bullshit, right? So that's the kind of stuff you get in JFOS. The best of that stuff will get ported into the second edition of OHJ, probably compressed. But what OHJ will have is a lot more citations. It will have some rewrites of material. So an example is this whole Philo thing that we're talking about. I'm going to reword that to forestall and shut up people who've been misreading it, right? So to make sure that it's so like I can talk about how I actually framed it and what's actually there, but I can reword it in a way that there's absolutely no fucking way you can claim that you're not misreading, that you're not getting it, right? So
Rick, that's a challenge. Okay, to these people, that's a challenge.
Oh, I know.
Okay?
Yeah. Well, I'm a professional at doing this now. Like this is I've made a career out of wording things in a way like my book, not related to this subject, but Why I'm Not a Christian, which is what is the subtitle is 4 Conclusive Reasons to Reject the Faith. And that's tiny, like that's a little thing. This is one you can hand out to Jehovah's Witnesses who show up at the door. They won't take it, but you can try. But that was all worded specifically to make impossible all the usual apologetics. And so it's much harder. The only way you can argue against it is to literally ignore what's in it, is the way. And so that's what I try to go for, is to frame things in a way that you cannot argue against this except by ignoring it, right? Like by claiming I said something other than I did. Anyway, so there'll be changes like that will improve the wording. There will be some additions of evidence, like some of the things that are in Jesus from Outer Space, like some more of the evidence of the angel of night, which I didn't know about when I wrote OHJ. There's an angel who actually takes, in the Jewish angelology, there's this angel called Night, Shelah, who takes the sperm out of men, flies to God and shows the sperm to God and says, will this be a rich man, a poor man, a bad man, a good man, or whatever? And then God pronounces, and then the angel goes back and puts it back in to the testicles of the man. And so this is a good example of the fact that, like, you think that's a weird ass fucking belief. It's what they believed, right? And so it shows the proof of concept, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I don't have in OHJ that I'm going to put in. And there's a few other things that are not in JFOS that I've been accumulating that'll end up in OHJ. But there's not going to be anything radically different. I think the thing that'll be the biggest difference will be that I will have either a chapter or a section talking about all of the rebuttals that have been attempted in peer-reviewed journal articles. So Gulata and all of that. I've written blog articles and all that. I might eventually assemble that into peer-reviewed articles for, the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus or something like that. But then what I want to do is do that and then get it summarized in OHJ so that there's a citation of all of the attempts to rebut it. And then so people will have a complete bibliography of rebuttals, and then my response to those rebuttals. So that will be in the second edition as well. So that will be like the main objective of the second edition, is that stuff. All of the minor stuff, like little errors, easily fixed errors and typos and stuff like that, that's already been taken care of in the corrected edition, which is coming out this year.
Yeah. Well, no, so Rick, you got to understand how my brain works, okay? Because I feel like if I were to get tested for ADHD, I probably would have a little bit of it. Because, like, listen, when you sit there and you describe how an angel takes the sperm out of some guy's nutsack and then takes it up to God and, like, holds it up and is like, rich man, poor man, which one is it? And then, God makes his, does his little Gryffindor or the little sorting hat on the sperm, and then goes back and, stuffs the sperm back in the nutsack. Like, I mean, I'm sitting there and my brain literally visualizes like the angel holding up individual sperm in front of God for him to sort it.
Yeah.
And like, so it's not that I think it is a weird belief, but I mean, I know they have a lot of weird beliefs.
Yeah. Because I think people like react to, oh, that's crazy and bizarre and weird. And it's like literally everything they believed was crazy, bizarre, and weird. Like you're being anachronistic if you expect it not to be crazy, bizarre, and weird. Like the whole theology, all their angelology, all of their demonology, all of their their beliefs about history, like it's crazy as fuck. And that's normal. Like that wasn't crazy. Like that was ordinary, right, for them. So if you want to actually understand the ancient mindset, you've got to go to the ancient mind and like start looking at the sort of stuff they believed. You've got to see things from their point of view, not from our point of view. Right.
So quick little just statement, liberal conspiracy. I see what you did there. Says, thanks for addressing those two directly. So you're welcome there, liberal conspiracy. And then we've got read between the lines, or L read L. Hi guys, I asked ChatGPT some on-topic questions, and one of the answers cited The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ by Brant Pitter.
Well, I'm assuming it's Petrie, but I could be wrong.
Okay. Ever hear of him? Got a PhD.
So I can't remember. I looked into this so many years ago that I've forgotten what I found. I must have found that he doesn't have a PhD. And I'm sure I found that the book was not peer reviewed. So, the Case for Jesus. Wait a minute. Okay, hold on. This is a different book that I'm thinking. The Case for Jesus by Petrie. No, I did look into this, but I can't remember what I found. Clearly, I wasn't impressed enough to write a blog. I would have blogged it if I thought it was worth writing about. So I can't answer this question because I actually don't remember what I found out about Petrie.
Okay.
Or
that's fair. Let's see. Then we got hold on. That's not a super chat. We gotta do super chat first. Stephen the Storyteller says, do you think that creating Christ is full of shit?
Is that Collada's book? Wait, what book is that?
I don't know. Let's see. Creating Christ.
I don't.
How Roman emperors invented. James. James
Valiant. Oh wait, is that what it's called? Oh yeah. Okay, sorry, that's silly. I've got the book right there.
I have to say, anytime that I see like a book that's titled something along the lines of how Roman emperors invented Christianity, like knowing like I'm definitely an amateur at this, right? But even knowing what I know, I'm like, there's no way that there's evidence for that.
Valiant is definitely a crank. He's very big on Mott and Bailey discourse, which I find extremely frustrating. Mott and Bailey is where you make a ridiculous claim and then someone attacks it, and then you retreat and claim you were making some other claim that's more defensible. And you go, oh, okay, I agree with that. And then they claim that you agreed with them on the ridiculous claim. And then they run back to they retreat to the Mott and run out to the Bailey. I have a whole article on Mott and Bailey discourse. Valiant does this so much that I can't stand it. So I had a debate with him actually on the Josephus passage, and he's wackadoo. So you can read my analysis of why I don't think he's competent in this issue at all in my article on Valiant and the Josephus question, which is on my blog. I did try reading the book, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever finish it. It's sitting here like it's one of my projects. I can't stand it because it's written by a crazy. It's like one of those crazy, any kind of conspiracy theory book where it's like they make like 1,000 statements, and like half of them are ridiculous and half of them aren't, and the ridiculous ones don't have footnotes and the non-ridiculous ones do. And so I'm like, I'm getting extremely tired. Like I've gotten through. How far have I gotten in this book? Yeah, I've gotten pretty far. So I'm up to page 77, and I still don't know what the fucking thesis of the book is. I have a zillion notes about crazy claims that are in here that I'm pretty sure are not even relevant to the thesis, right? But it just says a crazy thing. And I'm like, well, I'm going to have to fact check that. And then I go like every page, right? So like, I don't know. Anyway, and so I've done this for 77 pages where I'm like, I've got like 100 things I need to fact check. I'm pretty sure 99 of them are pointless. Like they don't even relate to the thesis. And so I can't, because I don't know what the thesis is. Like it hasn't gotten to it yet. I don't know which claims to prioritize, right? So, and I'm thinking at this point at page 77, and this is a book that only has like before you get to the appendixes, it's only 300 and some pages. I really don't want to continue. I'm like, why should I bother? I don't like, what's the point? And he was so crazy with the Josephus thing that I'm thinking like, oh yeah, this is like bullshit. No, to give you one like less subjective opinion about it. So the book appears to create the impression that their argument hinges on this coin and hinges on the iconography on this coin. And they make all these ridiculous, wild claims about the iconography on this coin. Now, outside the context of the book, he claims that that's not important. It's literally stated to be the most important thing in the book. So I don't know how it's important. I haven't got, it's page 77. I don't know why it's important. I don't know what the deal is. But he's going through this long argument about iconography, absolutely none of which is informed by any peer-reviewed iconography. So, for example, when he's talking about a coin, if you're doing, and I've done this, I wrote articles for the Skeptical Inquirer on a coin, an ancient coin, because Jerry Vardaman made wild, ridiculous claims unrelated to this. And I went to the British Museum. I literally like went through the vault, past the dudes with machine guns to go look at this coin and to write an article about it. And I wrote 2 articles, and those are both in my book, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. So if you're interested in my discoveries with this other ancient coin and this other wild, ridiculous claims, it's in there. But no, what you do, the first thing you do is you go look at what's called the numismatic literature. So numismatics is the study of coins. And there's a ton of peer-reviewed literature. There's standard volumes, like standard reference books on coins. So like there's Roman coins, like you go and you look in the book and it's got every coin that exists has a paragraph and it has a data about it and it has information. It'll have a bibliography. They never, like Valiant never cites any numismatic literature. So he doesn't identify where the coin is. He didn't talk about what numismatic treatise it's in, each coin has a numismatic number in the reference literature, kind of like a Strong's number. He doesn't tell us that. So I'm going to have to like spend probably days at a library trying to find all this stuff. And I'm thinking like, should I even bother at this point? Like, and the iconography is another example. Like we have tons of peer-reviewed literature on iconography. Like what do the symbols on coins mean? Why are they there? Why did an emperor choose a particular symbols at a particular time? Like there's a lot of literature on this. I'm not seeing any of it cited in here. And so he has all these wild theories about what the iconography means. It's like, yeah, but what does the mainstream literature say about the iconography? And why do you say something different? And what evidence do you have that you're right and they're wrong? Like everything that you would expect a scholar to do to like inform you about why their theory is true is not in there, or at least it's not up in there at any point between page 1 and page 77. And so this is to me, this signals crank. Like this is just the behavior of a crank, like just crazy claim, true but mundane claim, true but mundane claim, crazy claim, hundreds and hundreds of claims, throw so many claims at you that you just can't possibly fact check them all because you just don't have the time. Like you're not even gonna live long enough. And then like bury your thesis so deeply you can't even tell what the fucking thesis is, and base it on a coin and iconography without citing or discussing any of the numismatic or iconographic literature. And like this is just reeks of crank. And so that's my opinion at this point. Granted, it's an opinion only of someone who's read up to page 77 and debated another separate issue with the same author. But that's my take. So.
Yeah, when I'm looking for like academic sources or academic literature on certain topics, if I ever start running into just like a lot of speculative claims with very little evidence, I get totally uninterested like at that point.
And this gets back to peer review we talked about before. This is exactly the shit that peer review would clean out. Right? Like peer review would strip down a lot of this stuff. Say you can't make all these claims without footnotes, right? Like you can't not cite the numismatic literature. You can't not cite the iconographic literature. Like peer review would have prevented this. And that's why, having a book that's not peer reviewed is an important point. Like peer review would have fixed a lot of the problems of this book and would have cleaned up a lot of errors that, otherwise I'm going to have to spend hours and days fact checking. I don't want to. Like, why should I bother? I should just throw it in the trash, right? Like the whole point of peer review is to tell me that that's already been done, so I don't have to do it. Now, ideally, maybe I have to do it anyway, but at least if it was peer reviewed, the number of claims would be compressed, the citations would be cleaned up. It would be easy to figure out what the fucking thesis is, what the claims are being made, and where I need to look to fact check those claims. Like peer review would have fixed this problem. And that's why you can't just have randos publishing random books full of crazy, stream of consciousness statements, right? Like that's why you can't have that. That's what peer review is for. And that's why peer review matters. One of many reasons peer review matters. But yeah, no. So that's why, like, that's why now if someone writes a mythicist book and I first ask, is it peer reviewed? If it's not, I don't have the time and I don't care. Like if you can't be bothered to meet the standards of peer review, then you don't care about it enough. Like you care about it less than I do, right? So like, why should I care about it? If you don't even care about it enough to get it peer reviewed, I don't have a reason to care about it at this point. And that's, it takes a lot of convincing of me to not take that position. That's why I was so hesitant to read Doherty. Like it took a lot of respected opinions to convince me to read Doherty, because I'm like, why should I even bother? Like it hasn't passed peer review. I think it could have, and I think it would have been a better book. Jesus Puzzle would have been a better book had he done a peer review process. But back then it was harder to figure out how to do that or how that worked. So I can't blame him for that. But it's a good book. It has some flaws, but they're fixable. And so I talk about that in my review. But most books are not like that. Like Doherty is very exceptional. And just in the same way that Chrissy Hansen is very exceptional. Like she can write articles that pass peer review. Like most of these cranks can't do that. Like they not only can't do it, like they're so lazy, they don't even try. And that's the thing that offends me the most. Is like, you are so uncommitted to your thesis that you can't even try to get your stuff through peer review. I remember when I was talking to Atwill, when I had this long, crazy email debate with him years and years ago, when he threw one example at me that I thought would pass peer review, not for his thesis, it wouldn't support his thesis, but he found something that I thought was very interesting. It would totally make a great paper, and would totally like be a proper peer reviewed paper. And he could start building his argument by doing that, little pieces, getting them peer reviewed. But he couldn't be bothered. He didn't care. He didn't want to. Like he just wanted to keep pushing his like wackadoo theories. He didn't want to do any serious scholarship, even when I told him how and that he could. I think Valiant is the same way. Like there's a reason he's not getting anything peer reviewed. He can't and doesn't want to. And that's the problem.
Let's see. Hold on. We had a kind of a late super chat come out. I just had to pin that. So next question is, Richard, parlez-vous français?
Not fluently. So what I have is what's called translation competency. And it's a particular type of competency that is taught in grad schools, where if you give, so I know all the grammar. So if you give me a dictionary, I can translate something, and I can skim articles and get the gist, right? But I can't speak it and I can't hear it, because speaking is different, and hearing it that's a completely different thing than seeing it on the page, right? But even seeing on the page, I can get the gist, but I can't sit down and just translate at sight. I'm not that good, but I can translate with a dictionary, and I understand enough of the grammar to fix. Well, certainly I used to fix the auto translations like Google Translate. I could fix those. Now Google Translate is so fucking good. Like it's scary how good it is, actually. I can still fix it, but it's usually I don't have to. Like Google Translate's usually pretty solid nowadays. But no, that's what we're taught. Same with Latin and Greek. Like I can't translate Latin and Greek at sight. So I'm not as good at it like as Ehrman. Ehrman can read Greek just at sight, right? Like that's a really next level capability. But the thing is the key thing is, do you understand the grammar and do you understand the context, rather than do you know all 100,000 words off the top of your head, and all word forms, because Greek is an inflected language. It's super complicated. French is way easier. French is like one of the easiest languages. Latin is the only thing easier than French. But anyway, so no, I can't rap with you on speaking French. But I can write peer-reviewed articles about French, which I have done, weirdly enough. My German Studies Review article talks about how we can show, and how I did discover and show, that Hitler's Table Talk, the English translation of it, is translated from a French translation that is a deliberate mistranslation of the original German. And one of and there are things about grammar, the French grammar, that I was able to show that shows that like whoever translated the French into English was bad at French, and I was able to prove that because I know enough of the grammar of French to do it. And that's the kind of translation. That's what's called translation competency, and that is what I was taught in grad school. Same with German. I can do the same thing with German.
Yeah, and to a lesser degree, I remember in one of the classes that I took from you, part of it, was about the Greek. You had to use the Greek version of the New Testament in order to understand certain things that you were arguing. And so in the class, you actually said, oh well, you can use these online tools and you can see like how this word is used, where it's used, what authors have used it like in the ancient world and everything like that. So you kind of gave this sort of a brief crash course on on basically just how to if you don't know a language, you can look it up and figure out what's being said.
And then if you know basic grammar terms, that's helpful. And then experience, right? So like I've read so much Greek and translated so much Greek that I've seen so many different Greek forms, and so I know what's normal and what's weird. So that's where the translation competency comes in and becomes important. But I still have to, like, it's like any other like fact claim. If I'm going to talk about coins, Roman coins, for instance, that's not my specialty, but I do know a lot about it because I did study it. So, but if I'm going to make a claim about it, like for instance with the Valiant, I'm going to go check, right? I'm going to make sure. Now, I already know enough that I can tell what I'm reading, like it'll just reaffirm what I'm saying or maybe slightly correct it or whatever. But I know enough that I need to check, and I know how to check. And that's kind of like the importance with translation competency, is like, you know when you need to double check something before just assuming that you're right about it. And if you know enough about the grammar and you've done enough translating of Greek, for instance, you'll know, like, okay, I need to make sure which form of word this is, especially with Greek, because my God, it changes both. Verbs change on both the front and the back, and then the different combinations of vowels and consonants collapse into other combinations of vowels and consonants. Ancient Greek is pretty terrible. It's one of the hardest languages. The only language that's harder that I've been told is Russian. Russian is really hard. And Russian has some similarities to Greek. So it uses the Greek alphabet, a modified form of the Greek alphabet.
Oh, okay.
But Cyrillic comes through multiple etymological changes. It does come back to Greek. So there are some, if you know Greek, you'll recognize, like, the Russian R is the Greek R, for example. So Russian S is a Greek sigma. So anyway, Russian is really hard. Greek is close. Ancient Greek is close. Modern Greek is easier because it got streamlined a lot. But anyway, like, it's important. Yeah, you can go to my course on New Testament studies, which is what you're talking about, and I'll teach you all the online tools. There's super valuable tools like the Perseus tool, which does Greek analysis of Greek, and then you can find the dictionary entry, and it'll do a complete grammatical parsing. So it'll tell you what part of speech it is, like past tense, present tense, indicative, optative, all of that stuff. And then it'll give you like the full dictionary entry, and it has other tools. You can actually go find the word in other authors and see how it's been translated. Right. So like there's a lot of things that you can do with Perseus. I use the Thesaurus Lingua Graecae a lot, it's the TLG, which is a project out of University of Irvine, they've literally entered all Greek literature up to like 1400 something, literally everything from 800 BC all the way to 1492 or whatever the year is they end at. All Greek literature is in there, digitally searchable, and now you can even click on it, it'll give you dictionary entries and things like that. So I use that a lot, and knowing how to use it does require going through translation competency courses, and I had to pass a test, right, where they give you a complicated passage that you have to translate in class, like there now. But they do give you a dictionary, so that is the key thing. It's like you do it, you can't do it at sight, but if you've got a dictionary, you can figure it out and pass the test, and that gives you all the skills that you need to use all of these tools. And then the more you do it, the more you get a sense of what's normal and what's weird and how certain idioms work, and things like that. And so but every once in a while, you run into things that you're not familiar with, and then you have to research them. But now you have all the skills that you need to research them. And that's why it's important to do that. And I know, like, I'm pretty sure Valiant doesn't read Greek. Joseph Atwill definitely doesn't read Greek. Not even at what I'm talking about, which is translation competency. They can't even do that. And yet their arguments are fundamentally dependent on being able to do that. And that's another problem I have with cranks. Often is they want to make these arguments from English translations. They don't know how to check the Greek to see if that's actually what's there. Right. So, so Atwill makes a lot of like boner mistakes where he's making these etymological arguments based on the English translation that when you look at the Greek, they're just gone, right? Like that's not even there. So that's a problem. Anyway, so that's a long digression on a pointless subject. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Reality Revolutions said that Romans 1:3 equals 1 Kings 3:2 and Jeremiah 33.
That's not normally the passages I would think of. 1 Kings 3:2.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I don't know what you're talking about. Is that an incorrect? Did you type that wrong? So anyway, I'm not going to go to Jeremiah 33, but 1 Kings 3:2, I don't get the connection. What's more clearly being referenced in Romans 1:3 is the Nathan prophecy, which is in, I think, 1 Samuel, maybe 2 Samuel. I can't remember offhand. But there is a passage in the Septuagint that it's definitely riffing on. And I talk about that. I have an article on Romans 1:3, the empirical logic in Romans 1:3, which is on my blog. I go into the Nathan prophecy and how it connects. I would be interested in knowing, I haven't gone and checked if there's other connections to prophecy. I'm only interested in the Nathan prophecy because it's relevant to how I interpret Romans 1:3. There might be other scriptural references going on in there, but they, unless they're relevant to anything I argue, I haven't gone into it.
Okay. Next, we've got the Yellow Stoic, who says, do you think that a compatibilist approach between mythicism and historicity is valid or probable as a future academic consensus position?
So this depends on what we mean by compatibilist. The only thing I can think of is the position of not caring, right? So saying well, and a lot of mainstream scholars say this, is that, well, there was a guy, but we can know nothing about him, right? That's practically mythicism. And so that's in a sense, there's a lot of academics, mainstream academics, who are already there, who are already saying yeah, I'm going to say shibboleth and assuage and calm down all my colleagues by saying there was a Jesus, but I'm going to say that we know nothing about him and it has nothing to do with the origins of Christianity. Right. And so, so that is actually an increasingly more common position to find in academia now. And that is, I think, trying to thread the needle. I think that's what's going on there. I don't know what other position would count as a compatibilist position, other than agnosticism about the historicity of Jesus, saying that it doesn't matter to the origins of Christianity. And there are already scholars who say that. But I'm more interested in what is defensible. And I think the evidence is what the evidence is, right? So the reason I'm a mythicist and not, like Lataster, just an agnostic, is that I do think the evidence points more strongly, slightly, but more strongly against historicity. And the only reason I take that position is because that's where the evidence took me. If the evidence took me to straight agnosticism, that's where I would have been instead. So there's a difference between what do we think is the correct position in terms of what does the evidence support, and then there's the question of what heuristically, rhetorically would satisfy and calm and not trigger our peers in academia. And those are two different problems. One concerns the truth and the other does not. And that's why I don't usually entertain these kinds of questions for that reason. I'm more interested in what's true. I'm less interested in what will not trigger people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next is the Mythic Life, who says that I have 170 plus undergraduate credits. I've attended classes at 3 universities and 1 college. Dr. Carrier is definitely one of the most honest scholars I've run across. Do yourself a favor and read his work.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely.
I work really hard. I really do, to make sure that my arguments are as sound as possible and that I've thoroughly researched things. So it is nice to be appreciated for that, rather than thrown in with people who don't do the work. Even if I'm wrong, at least I've worked hard and given you a lot of bibliography to work with. So.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, just the value of reading what you're saying, and then you have a footnote, and then checking, your citations and everything, all of that is a very good practice, and it allows you to learn a whole lot more.
Yeah, I super encourage it. And this is how I became a scholar, right? And that's how they train you, is to do that, right? It's run down all the footnotes. If you want to become smart and know a lot of stuff, you just do that, right? And follow your passion. If something looks interesting, the passion will drive you. That will keep you from getting bored, and seeing this as tedious. You'll see it as exciting and interesting. But follow the threads that excite you. Deep dive. Follow a footnote to a source. Follow that source to another footnote to another source, etc. That to me is super fun, and that's how I've learned shit tons of things. I used to tell people, and I don't know, what am I say? Used to. I still tell people that 99% of what you do as a historian is verify that something is useless. And to explain that is when I was doing my dissertation at Columbia, I would spend days, weeks in libraries reading hundreds, thousands of articles and books and things. And 99% of the things I checked were of no use. But I had to be able, but I had to check them to know that. And I had to be able to say in my dissertation defense, if someone said, did you read such and such a book? Does it challenge your hypothesis? Does it say anything about this? You had to be able to say, honestly, no, I checked that and it doesn't. And like literally 99% of what I did was verify that something's useless. But in the process, you're reading these books and these articles that are useless to your thesis, but they're full of facts and interesting information. And so once you've done this for like 8 years, you know a lot of fucking shit, right? Because you've read so much stuff on all these random weird tangents that, yeah, you think like, oh my God, like 99% of that is useless to my thesis, but it's not useless. It's just useless to your thesis, but it's still tons of knowledge. And the way you do that is what you're talking about now is like follow the footnotes, go fact check things, go read the source. And you might even be excited. Like you go read, like someone cites Diodorus and you go read Diodorus to check the one thing. But then you find it's in the context of this paragraph talking about some completely different thing that's super interesting. And then you start reading Diodorus, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that is exciting about history. And you get into those fun little corners of history when you do start doing this, fact-checking historians. Even if you keep confirming that they're telling the truth, you're still finding a lot of cool shit and learning the skill of doing that. So it's always worth it. And so I always encourage it.
Definitely. And then finally, from Jacob B, Jacob sent a super chat for, I guess somebody else asking the same question. Jacob asked, Dr. Carrier, what would you expect to see or have happen to make Jesus mythicism Doherty Carrier version mainstream?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. The main problem, of course, is that the rhetoric that misrepresents what's been argued, claims that it's ridiculous or that it's false, etc., by not accurately representing what the arguments are and stuff. All of this discourages scholars from reading it. It's designed to do that. Like that's the point of it. It's just like 2 Peter and Ignatius. Like they don't want you to read it. And so they need to misrepresent what's in it to convince them that it's not worth their time. And you find that a lot. And there's a lot of disingenuous and dishonest argumentation that does this. And you see this in academia. It goes along. What we need is to counteract that. So we need to convince scholars to actually read the book, right? On the historicity of Jesus or Lataster's questioning the historicity of Jesus, one or the other. They just need to read it, right? Rather than like be convinced that it's not worth their time. They should just read it. And so what I was thinking, like if I ran into millions of dollars, like I suddenly won the lottery or something, one of the things that I would do is I would go to the Westar Institute and I would say, I'm going to fund you. I'm going to give you like $1 million. What I want you to do is I want you to get a panel together of leading scholars, like PhDs, professors, etc. Literally pay them to read the book and pay them to write like considered reviews, not just reviews that are half-assed and polemical or whatever, but no, like take this seriously. This is your job. We're paying you to do this. Like write a reasonable, considered review of this book. And then turn this into a book. The Westar Institute would publish it just like all the other the Jesus Seminar projects that they've done. I think that would be the most valuable things we could do is we could just get scholars to read it and to write their honest opinion about it. And I think what we're getting dishonest opinions about it. We're getting polemics. We're getting apologetics. No one who's got like an even keel, like objective interest in this is doing the work of like reading the book and doing an honest sort of like effective review of the book. That's what we need. And I think the pressure campaign is just convincing people to avoid it. It's a third rail, so no one wants to do it. So I think the only way to get around that is to pay them to do it. And so we need some philanthropists who will just literally just fucking pay people to do it. And some scholars like are so busy, like Goodacre, for instance, has got so many projects. I don't think there's any amount of money that you could pay him to do it, but you could find scholars who are fully qualified, who are not Christian apologists, who are not like dogmatically sold on one side of this or the other, and who are probably underpaid because we know that academia is like fucked, You could probably find someone who's a decent, qualified person, who's an unbiased, objective observer that you could pay to do this. And I think that could be done. And that's the thing that I would like to see done. But I mean, that's like every other problem. If you throw money at it, you could solve it. But, you know, no one has the money and no one's going to throw the money at it. So it's kind of a pipe dream. But I think that's what has to happen, is that you've got to motivate objective scholars who don't have a horse in the race, to actually care enough to put in the work, to actually do the reading and actually do a proper review. That's what we actually need. And it's a question of how do you get that to happen? Money is the only thing I can think of that would.
Yeah. And then we've got one last one. End Time Show, my donation to the cause. $999,995 more to go.
Yeah, I saw that. Nice.
So I feel like, as far as like the whole mainstream bit of it, I don't know. I feel like a lot of things are stunted by the fact that, you know, so many people are, I guess, just genuinely apathetic, like, about the history in this particular, like, all other areas of history, they're concerned with, they concern themselves with it, but once it comes to this, it's like they're totally apathetic about it. I've kind of encapsulated the absurdity of this, or at least why I find it absurd whenever I get this pushback, because, like, people are like, hey, listen, I don't really care whether or not Jesus actually existed in history. I don't care about having evidence for that or anything. The real question is, did he resurrect from the dead?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay. So you care more about disproving magic than, you know, investigating history. That is like a real academic question.
Yeah.
And even we didn't get to it tonight, but even Chrissy Hansen, in the interview with Neil there, she says this is a legitimate question to ask, and it's been asked of several different historical figures in the past. But it's like, people are like, I don't care, I just want to know if a Jew magically resurrected from the dead. Okay.
Yeah. which actually, that gets to like what we could do in a future show. Is I have thoughts about what, because Chrissy Hansen pointed out, she has a whole section, and she's right, where she points out how Christian apologists are completely hosing this. Their attempts to rebut mythicism are so bad that it's actually discrediting Christianity, right? So, like, she's pointing out, like, and she wants to write an article about how to tell them, like, how to not do this so badly, like how to do a more competent critique of Jesus mythicism. And I agree with her. Like, I think mythicists, apologists, I mean, are like really behind the ball, like, or like doing a really bad job of this. So, so I think that's important to note, but it illustrates the point that I think is important to point out here, which is that mythicism keeps historicists honest. Like, taking it seriously and engaging with it will help you eliminate weak arguments for historicity. And so, regardless of where you think you're going to land on the historicity of Jesus, it is still worth your while to seriously and honestly engage with actual peer-reviewed mythicism in order to, like, basically clean your attic. Essentially, is like, make sure, like, okay, yeah, I got to have like an honest response to this stuff. And you might realize that a lot of your arguments are weak and you got to chuck them. And that might refine your case to something that is more defensible. And so it would actually make, in principle, it would make historicity stronger if you have the goods in the long run. But there's no other way to make it stronger than to do this, is to honestly steelman your opposition and really engage with it. And so I think mythicism is really important for historicity. So if you are pro-historicity, you should take seriously the need to properly read and properly respond to Jesus mythicism. You need to be able to do that. But only peer-reviewed mythicism. You can ignore all the crank shit. The peer-reviewed stuff is, the whole point of peer review is it shows you that this is competent, serious stuff. It's not, you know, Valiant's creating Christ. It's stuff that's actually like taken the care to properly document everything, properly identify their arguments and so on, so that you can evaluate it. And so I think this actually helps historicity. So even if you're pro-historicity, you should believe in taking this seriously and really like putting in the time to read the book and take it like not just skim it or rage blog it, but like literally like, okay, yeah, I'm like let me figure out what my opposition is and steelman it, make it like, what is the strongest version of this argument, and do I still have a response to that? Like, can I respond to the steelman rather than just the straw man? And I think that would actually help historicity, and this is something that we could talk about more possibly in another episode.
Oh, definitely. We're gonna have to extend it because we're already 3.5 hours.
I know, longer than we expected.
Yeah, it's an hour and a half longer than I actually expected us to go.
You might have to make it a 2-part or split it somehow.
Yeah, we definitely will. But in any case, thank you so much, Rick, for coming on and going through some of these things. Like I said, we do have some more in at least my document of what I wanted to cover, and so we'll have to hit on that sometime, probably in April or something like that. I'll try to figure out another time. And Rick, I'm so glad that you're able to come on here and spend so much time with me. And I can't wait to have you on again. All of the heathens out there, we're actually going to forego tomorrow night's stream because we've had 2 straight nights of streaming, and I need a break.
Yeah, fair.
So, but anyways, Rick, do you want to shill yourself out? Let people know where they can find you and everything like that. I do have links to relevant articles in the description. So if you guys want to go and check
and anybody who dropped in late, go back when this is archived, and you can go back to the beginning. I talk a little bit about like how to support me and what my work is and where to find it, how to explore my social media and make the most out of it. So that's all the front end of this. But TLDR is just go to richardcarrier.info, explore all the links, like everything's there. My Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, my Patreon, if you want to help support my blogging, my teaching, if you want to take classes, that's there. The blogs are there. All my books you can find discussed there. And people often ask me, I didn't point this out earlier, but people often ask me, like, which book should I buy of all the many that I've written? It depends on your interests. So I actually wrote an article on this, which is a guide to my books. So you can go to my blog, search guide to my books, and it has like 1 paragraph in each book on what would be the reason to pick that book. And then you can figure out which one you want to start with. And all my books, except for Jesus from Outer Space, all my books are also available on Audible, read by me. I just haven't found time to record for JFOS. So it's the only reason that doesn't exist yet, but I really want to do it. It keeps getting pushed on my calendar. Literally, it's like on my calendar for next weekend, but I'm sure that's going to get pushed because I've got too much stuff going on.
Yeah, Casey just volunteered to record it for you if you want.
What? No. Are you selling her out on that? Is that?
No, she was like, I'll read it.
If she's serious, I might take her up on that.
Yeah, she's like, okay, I'll do it.
Get in touch with me about that. Like, if you're serious, I can set you up.
Yeah, okay. She did a big thumbs up, so we might be hearing KC on the on JFOS in the future. Yeah. But in any case, Rick, again, thank you so much for joining me. Links are in the description if you want to go and check out Rick's work, get his books or anything like that. We will be doing another part of this probably next month in April, just depending on when our schedules mesh. And I guess we will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. Bye, heathens.